Chapter 2, Summer of the Rise of the Sultancy. We arrived back in Tasmania before the new academic year, which gave us plenty of time to take a trip to Halls Falls and investigate events occurring there. The email we received was all we could talk about on the way home from Africa, so we were overjoyed to see Uncle Artis had us packed up and ready to go first thing the next morning. That was the first time Errol and I would see the property they purchased in person. Our only other exposure to it was through the video Travis and TM shot when they captured the first sight of the Thylacynus cynocephalus family several years ago. The trip to Halls Falls was 4 hours no matter which route we took from Hobart, so we decided to meet up with Uncle Arthur at Dolphin Sands along the way. The A3 from Hobart took us through Buckland on our way up to Oxford and the beautiful beaches that dotted the coastline in that part of Tasmania. We continued on the A3 or Tasmanian Highway though Triabunna at the end of Spring Bay and on to Little Swanport, where we stopped to stretch our legs. This coast was where most of the whaling occurred 100 years ago. It must have been so easy to sit and wait. Our final leg to Uncle Arthur's led through Rocky Hills and Swansea before we arrived at Dolphin Sands and Uncle Arthur's place. He was, of course, standing at the end of his driveway with one foot resting on a case of cold ones and a firm grip on the one he had to his mouth. We spent that night at Uncle Arthur's packing up items he had picked up for us that were going on to Halls Falls. Once the work was done, we found ourselves indulging in one of his famous barbies and some tales from the Australian bush. Tasmania has one nasty snake, but Australia has 100 that can push your pendulum past its pivot. Errol and I actually got to sleep in the house, so we didn't need to unpack the tent and clear the area of tiger snakes, my main fear. I was trying to get used to living with snakes, but I couldn't fathom a permanent residence in India, Australia, or Africa. Maybe Castle Sel Trodat. What can get me there? The next morning, we completed our journey through country, which continued to get more rugged as we got closer to our destination. We followed the A3 through to Cranbrook and Absalon before we hit the coast again at Bicino. Through the Douglas River area, we followed the highway beyond the chain of lagoons and on to Falmouth. We stayed on the coast until heading inland at St. Helens to make a stop where Uncle Artis needed to pick up additional equipment from a self-storage unit. Finally, we reached the Groom River, which would lead us to our access to the Halls Falls area. Our new property was off Anchor Road but included the Halls Falls general area. We pulled into the camp where directly ahead of us was what appeared to be someone's residence. As we continued around to the back of the building where another road led to a much more extensive complex of buildings out of sight from the road, we realized it was an illusion. These buildings included a laboratory, a workshop, and several kennels. Uncle Artis had done an excellent job in making it appear nondescript from the road. Halls Falls, on the Groom River, drops from a 19th century weir located upstream from the waterfall. The weir was created by Chinese miners working the region's mineral veins for tin. Back in the day, tin was required for household utensils, including pots, pans, candle holders, oil lamps, and lanterns. Lots of rock pools add valuable terrain that the thylacine would love for hunting their prey. Huge stumps remained as a reminder of the tall trees that were felled over a century ago by the early settlers wanting to sail away from here. I mentioned to the boys that snakes seemed to like the same habitat and that seemed to entertain them. Easily followed trails traversed the area, but TM and Travis were careful to avoid any tourist areas that might attract visitors at certain times of the year. Everyone put on their snake protectors in the morning, but we stayed on the path most of the time. TM and Travis did a lot of what they called bush bashing, where they forced their way through some of the densest terrain on the plant. This may have been the shortest route between two places, but there are not many people who are going to follow them through the myrtle. To distract visitors, they even reconstructed some of the existing paths to veer away from areas of interest to them. Late one night, we sat in the cabin watching the monitors and discussed the road in front of us from DNA sample to cloned animals set to be released into the wild. Cloning is a technique to make exact genetic copies of living things. We can make genes, cells, tissues, and even whole animals. Nature has clones. Single-celled organisms like bacteria make exact copies of themselves each time they reproduce, or perhaps they make phages, but they create a replica. I told them. Identical twins are very similar to clones because they share almost the exact same genes, having been created from one fertilized egg split in two. We make clones in the lab. To clone a gene, we take DNA from a living creature and insert it into a carrier like a bacteria or yeast so that every time that carrier reproduces, a new copy of the gene is made. I tried to keep it as untechnical as I could without dumbing it down. Although each of their lives had steered away from formal education, that didn't mean they were not an intelligent group of people. Passion for what they were doing fueled their zest for learning. Bite-sized, I thought. Animals can be cloned in one of two ways. Embryo twinning is where we first split an embryo in half. Those two halves are then placed in a mother's uterus. Each part of the embryo develops into a unique animal, and the two animals share the same genes. What's the other way, mate? Uncle Arthur asked. The second method is called somatic cell nuclear transfer. Somatic cells are all the cells that make up an organism except sperm or egg cells. Sperm and egg cells contain only one set of chromosomes, and when they join during fertilization, the mother's chromosomes merge with the father's. Somatic cells, on the other hand, already contain two full sets of chromosomes. We transfer the DNA from an animal somatic cell into an egg cell that has had its nucleus and DNA removed. The egg then develops into an embryo which contains the same genes as the cell donor. The embryo must then be implanted into an adult female's uterus to grow. Errol added, and marsupials are slightly different in that the joey must make it to the pouch, which in the case of the thylacine is pointing backward or down, not up like a roux. Uncle Artis, you must remember Dolly the sheep, I said, and both he and Uncle Arthur shook their heads in the affirmative. 25 years ago, Dolly was cloned using an udder cell taken from an adult sheep. Today, all kinds of animals have been cloned or are being cloned as we speak. Who knows what's happening in parts of the world where information doesn't travel? At least to our ears. Like China. Technically, no humans have been created yet, but we may just be naive. And I paused for reflection and to wet my whistle. Uncle Artis was passing out cold ones from the fridge. Errol added, of course, they didn't get it right with Dolly the first time. How many attempts? And I replied, almost 300. The Dr. Moreau-like images flickered through everyone's thoughts. Travis predicted, someday clones will be able to resurrect pets for wealthy owners that have the foresight to have them cloned while they're still alive. In his most sarcastic voice. How about we save the giant panda or thylacine first, mate? TMer added indignantly. I had to return to Hobart to attend to some loose ends for both myself and Cheesy, who had to postpone his Tasmanian projects to accommodate Florin and Dr. Roz. Both Errol and I were run ragged during those couple weeks taking care of our PhD projects, business clients, and individual pursuits like the Tigers and Devils. The only distraction from that routine was a call from Ian to let me know he had relocated to Windhaven before the new year and was opening the medical clinic on-site to treat locals as well as work with the research teams to investigate local issues in medicine with an eye to implementing possible real solutions. The new antivenom lab will eventually save many local lives, but will not necessarily generate any profits at all. That's why up to this point even the hospitals have been trying to get away with Indian anti-venom as better than nothing because it's all they can afford. That's good money after bad. Then he paused for a moment during the conversation and his tone changed somewhat. I remember him saying, Uncle Sandu was back in Moldavia looking for a book just as he told us he was, but what he neglected to tell us was which book it was. It turned out to be a very specific book, the book Uncle Ivan stole from Tavarius Seltrodet, which resulted in his death. How did Uncle Sandu expect to get the book? Why now? I asked. Ivan had agreed to sell it to Uncle Sandu, who believed Ivan to be of ill health and most certainly on his deathbed. Instead, when Uncle Sandu arrived in St. Petersburg, Ivan had him kidnapped and held him for ransom. He wanted the template page to reveal the secret formula. I gasped. Yes. All of his animals that were treated with the formula were now deceased. It was the cornerstone of his circus. Without the animals, his circus was too common to compete in today's market. Ian replied. What happened? And he told me, that Jack's oldest brother Stefan was working the Eastern Route Seltrodet circus, which was also in St. Petersburg at the time. He and some of his people tried to rescue Uncle Sandu, and in the ensuing fracas, Stefan was killed. Holy shit! I said, and he continued, Florin was able to reach out to one of Ivan's offspring, Jacob, whom he had known since they were children. Jacob couldn't believe his father had killed another Seltrodet for the second time. That was the final straw. There wasn't going to be a third time lucky for his father. Together with Florin and two of the other Seltrodet brothers, who came from Vladivostok, they orchestrated a rescue as well as retrieved the book. Does that mean what I think it means? And he replied, Florin tells me there is still a ways to go with the interpretation of the two pieces. He's never even seen anyone execute this formula, let alone mastered it himself. He has so many irons in the fire right now as well. Unfortunately, in the rescue of Uncle Sandu, Ivan was killed by his own son Jacob. It was an unusual distraction, but Cheesy was already in Moldavia, so just Errol and I flew over for the funeral. Again, it made me think of the family structure and the family experience for the people I knew. Errol and I were attending to support the living members of the family because we didn't know Stefan, but we did know the loss that was being felt by Marius, Marion, Darla, Magda, and Krista, and most certainly Florin, Uncle Sandu, and the Baroness. I think if one of them passed away, it would feel like family to me. Certainly, Errol and his kin, Cheesy, Ian, Dick and Carl all felt like family to me, or what I imagined family was supposed to feel like. My Uncle David, whom I had never seen, or even my father, who was mostly busy living his own life with the Duchess, didn't instill those feelings in me. I guess I missed what the blood connotation implied in the word family, and the need to have similar DNA, and for that matter genes. Stefan was to be buried on the property of Castle Seltrodet in a cemetery where the remains of more than 300 ancestors preceded him over the years. Stefan's spot was assigned to him the day he was born. I thought it was a little macabre to be able to visit the place your mortal remains will be interned for whatever the afterlife has in store for them. As we strolled through the cemetery on that rainy day in Moldavia, I thanked my lucky stars that the vacant plots were not marked. But I did get that damn shiver this place sends through me every now and then. Other than Sir Malcolm's funeral, I hadn't attended any such gatherings, but I did know that pallbearers were people significant in the life of the deceased. Historically, pallbearers were men, but, on this day, it was simply 6 family members who loved Stefan, Marius, Marion, Florin, Darla, Magda, and Krista. There did not seem to be any type of religious figure in charge of the interment, but rather each person in turn was given a flower which they dropped into the grave as they stopped to say whatever it was that they wanted to say. Magda told me, Rosa Canina, or the dog rose as they call it. A climbing native of the wild rose species. Very versatile with two dominating themes of pain and pleasure. It was Stefan's favorite. An interesting choice, I thought, but I didn't know Stefan and whether or not that choice was indicative. Before heading back to Tasmania, after the funeral, Errol and I had an opportunity to catch up with Cheesy. When you had the opportunity to converse with Cheesy on an intellectual level, you began to realize how brilliant he really was in those days. Normally in a crowd of people he wanted to be the life of the party and bring an energy to the event and time that wouldn't be there without him. Whenever Errol recants a story about a party or bar hop, Cheesy likes to say no matter how good a party it was, it would have been better if he'd been there. And he's probably right, but this was a solemn occasion. Errol and I retired to the lounge with Ian, Dr. Sue, and Dr. Ben when Cheesy chose this time to talk about what he knew best, artificial intelligence. DNA is simply an organism's operating system from boot up till the blue screen of death. I create operating systems. I control operating systems. I improve operating systems. I take over operating systems. People use computers to do what they need them to do without questioning how they do it. That's what I do. I make them do it. I speak the language of the machine, I speak to each chip in the system, I travel the fastest circuits and pathways in 3 dimensions, to reach the smallest bank of registers on the smallest chip on the board to flip a single register on or off. I like to stand on my toes. DNA is simply the most complicated motherboard in our reality, but I'm confident I can write the operating system to allow her power to be harvested. We'll speak the language DNA, we'll send the messenger to the ribosome, use our chimera codons down the fastest pathways, to reach the smallest of genes we want to clip from the termini at one end to the termini at the other. We wanted. He paused, sighed, and then continued, regardless of the computing power required, software is the intelligence, software is the solution. I know all of you in this room and I know how fast you learn things and the millions of instructions per second passing through your brains. Dr. Sue's brain is normally on fire and Ian is generally giving us his Doctor Strange look into the future gaze, but I can ramp even those learning paths exponentially with artificial intelligence so that we can figure this puzzle out. Even Dr. Sue sleeps 6 hours a night and we only have one of her, he said, and she blushed. Cheesy took a more serious tone and began to explain his reasoning. Whole genome sequencing is an important tool for detecting genomic variation. Blood-derived DNA is the current standard for WGS research or clinical purposes. As you know, we have this for the thylacine. Whole genome sequencing is the process of determining the entirety, or near entirety of the DNA sequence of an organism's genome at a single time. It entails sequencing all of an organism's chromosomal DNA as well as DNA contained in the mitochondria. If we were looking at plants, we'd also look in the chloroplast. I added. I knew that X-ray crystallography was used to investigate molecular structure by observing the patterns formed by X-rays shot through a crystal of the substance. It was used to understand the structure of DNA. Put that together with Chargaff's rules that showed the 4 monomers or nucleotides present in a DNA molecule. 2 types were always present in equal amounts and the remaining 2 types were also always present in equal amounts. This meant they were always paired in some way. Consider the structure of the 2 types of nucleic acids that exist, deoxyribonucleic acid known as DNA and ribonucleic acid, which we know as RNA. To build blocks of DNA you require nucleotides consisting of 3 component parts or raw material. These include a deoxyribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base. These 4 flavors of nitrogenous bases in our soda shop include our old favorites, adenine, A, and guanine, G, the double-ring purines, along with cytosine, C, and thymine, T, the smaller, single-ringed pyrimidines. The nucleotide is named according to the nitrogenous base it contains. Of course, there is massive chemistry involved behind all this. The phosphate group of one nucleotide bonds covalently with the sugar molecule of the next nucleotide, and so on, forming a long polymer of nucleotide monomers. The sugar-phosphate groups line up in a backbone for each single strand of DNA, and the nucleotide bases stick out from this backbone. The carbon atoms of the 5-carbon sugar are numbered clockwise from the oxygen as 1 foot, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The phosphate group is attached to the 5-foot carbon of one nucleotide and the 3-carbon of the next nucleotide. In its natural state, each DNA molecule is actually composed of 2 single strands held together along their length with hydrogen bonds between the bases. Base pairing takes place between a purine and a pyrimidine, namely, A pairs with T, and G pairs with C, adenine and thymine being complementary base pairs, while cytosine and guanine are also complementary base pairs. This is the basis for Chargaff's rule. Because of their complementarity, there is as much adenine as thymine in a DNA molecule and as much guanine as cytosine. Adenine and thymine are connected by 2 hydrogen bonds, while cytosine and guanine are connected by 3 hydrogen bonds. Easy peasy. The 2 strands are antiparallel in nature, that's to say, one strand will have the 3-carbon of the sugar in the upward position, whereas the other strand will have the 5-carbon in the upward position. The diameter of the DNA double helix is uniform throughout because a purine with its 2 rings is always paired with a pyrimidine or 1 ring, and their combined lengths are always equal. Nature's mathematics always turns out to be elegant in hindsight. Where's the Fibonacci sequence? The second nucleic acid in all cells known as ribonucleic acid is RNA. Like DNA, RNA is a polymer of nucleotides. Each of the nucleotides in RNA are made from the same raw materials. In the case of RNA, the 5-carbon sugar is ribose, not deoxyribose. Ribose has a hydroxyl group at the 2-foot carbon, unlike deoxyribose, which has only a hydrogen atom. Damn chemistry again. RNA nucleotides contain the nitrogenous bases adenine, cytosine, and guanine, but they don't contain thymine, which is instead replaced by uracil, U. RNA exists as a single-stranded molecule rather than a double-stranded helix. There are several kinds of RNA based on their function. Now the fun begins, because this part is like a software update, as Cheesy would say. Messenger RNA, denoted as mRNA, transfer RNA or tRNA, and ribosomal RNA aka rRNA molecules are involved in the production of proteins from the DNA code. Let the unfolding begin. Errol and Dr. Ben favor these tools for solving their respective genetic puzzles. But this gets me no closer to identifying individual genes and finding out how and when they evolved to move humanity to its final destination. DNA is a working molecule, replicate to divide, read to produce molecule. Dr. Su gave us a bit of a history lesson. The DNA sequencing methods used 50 years ago were manual, Maxim Gilbert, or Sanger sequencing. Several whole bacteriophage and animal viral genomes were sequenced that way. Can you imagine the work? The first organism to have its entire genome sequenced was Haemophilus influenza. Then genomes of other bacteria and some archaea were sequenced, largely because of their small genome size, but humans contain roughly 3.2 billion nucleotide pairs in each germ cell. Cheesy added, the first bacterial and archaeal genomes were sequenced by shotgun sequencing. That's a service we're going to offer in TAS when I get back. Errol's already spoken to the client. With that project I will finish my PhD, and you will have to address me as Dr. Cheesy. The first multicellular eukaryote, an animal, to have its whole genome sequenced was the nematode worm Cenorhabditis elegans. Errol added just to show he was listening. Dr. Su, not wanting to be outdone, added, the first insect genome sequenced was the fruit fly Drosophila melanogaster, a popular organism used in experimental research. Not wanting to be left out and looking uneducated, I added, the first plant genome fully sequenced was Arabidopsis thaliana. Now there's an unlikely contender, a roadside weed. Dr. Ben turned to Cheesy and put the closure on the conversation with, don't forget the laboratory mouse Mus musculus. He had a taste for a bit of cheese, as I recall. And that lightened the mood perhaps a little too much, so we decided it was time to break up our little party and say our goodbyes. Cheesy had hired a classmate from his California crew to relocate to Tasmania and work with us on sequencing, but had to postpone the start date until he finished up in Moldova. She's from in the Netherlands and is anxious to see this part of the world, but I'm going to keep her too busy for that. Her name's Marjolian Creek and I give her top marks in software design and system development. Currently thousands of genomes have been wholly or partially sequenced, so making sense of all the data is going to take a new approach from what people today call logic. Errol asked if she was coming alone and Cheesy let us know. Marjolian is married to a fellow by the name of Otto Natun. I met him a couple of times when we were at school. He works for a seed company in Holland and has arranged with them to set up a satellite facility down under so that he can manage it. Your mom is going to help them find a place in Hobart. On the flight back to Taz we talked about managing big data genome banks. Errol had found out huge amounts of biological and clinical data have been generated, collected, and stored in the last few years. But it's occurring at an unprecedented speed and scale with the new generation of sequencing technologies enabling almost anyone with a minor degree to process DNA sequence data. Electronic health records are documenting large amounts of patient data that can all be linked to DNA for less than noble purposes. The cost of acquiring and analyzing biomedical data is expected to decrease dramatically with the help of technology upgrades. It was part of Errol's responsibilities to research all the equipment purchased for our various locations that we had on the go. Mary would then set about to get us the best price and fastest delivery. Ideas and opportunities in this industry were a dime a dozen at that point in time, but they all required the knowledge to create and the equipment implement. It seemed we were lucky enough to have both in vast endless quantities. The emergence of sequencing machines produced read lengths as short as 30 to 40 nucleotides, posing challenges for genome assembly and annotation, which had issues in assembly projects with fragmented DNA. The development of novel hardware and software for parallel computing was also pushing the pendulum from another direction. Think about processor-intensive applications you may use on your computers and consider doing that in multiple windows concurrently, and that's parallel computing. Parallel computing cannot be achieved by hardware or software alone, but only through a combination, according to Cheesy. There are operating system characteristics which are necessary to achieve parallelism as well as an algorithm to map tasks to different processors and execute them simultaneously. Parallel hardware is another aspect of parallelism that has the capability to execute multiple instructions simultaneously. Cheesy gave us a formula for achieving parallelism. Parallel hardware plus parallel operating system plus parallel algorithm equals parallel system achieving parallelism. The Big Data Center at Beijing Institute of Genomics, BIG, Chinese Academy of Sciences, provided a suite of database resources like the Genome Sequence Archive, which was a data repository for archiving raw sequence reads. It supported data generated from a variety of sequencing platforms ranging from Sanger sequencing machines to single-cell sequencing machines. It provided data storing and sharing services free of charge for worldwide scientific communities. According to Cheesy, it was a very user-friendly web interface that simplifies data entry, but then you have to consider that it's Cheesy saying something is easy. The file portion contains the raw sequence reads, which was the most significant. The most basic file type for this sort of data, at the time, was known as FAST. At least for public repositories, that was the case. Essentially, FAST files were simply text files, but according to Cheesy, they could be manipulated with standard Unix tools, like cat, head, or grep. Cheesy told us, grep is the most useful tool for patterned matching, allowing specific patterns by regular expression. Compressed sequence files were more than 100 terabytes in size. It boggles the mind, so why even mention those kinds of numbers that no one can really image? The Gene Expression Nebulas was a data portal of gene expression profiles based entirely on RNA-seq data. While the Genome Variation Map was a comprehensive collection of genome variations for featured species. The Genome Warehouse was a centralized resource housing genome-scale data with a particular focus on economically important animals and plants. Feeding the planet should always a noble quest. The Methylation Bank was an integrated database of whole genome single-base resolution methylomes and provided visualization of high-resolution DNA methylation data. It incorporated high-quality whole genome bisulfite sequencing methylome maps for 5 economically important crops. All of these resources were publicly available to anyone with a computer anywhere in the world. With some extra money flowing into her coffers of late, Errol's mom Mary decided to put her hard-earned Aussie dollars to work for her in the stock market. She'd been asking Cheesy, Errol and myself which companies were creating the best new technology with products on the market. She had a portfolio of stocks with no more than 100 shares invested in any one particular company. Cheesy referred to it as her Shogun portfolio, but it was nothing to be sneered at. Her holdings included Illumina, Pacific Biosciences, Helicos Biosciences, Intelligent Biosystems, Life Technologies, and Oxford Nanopore, which was the exception to the 100-share rule she made for herself. It may have just been the fact that it had Oxford in its name. These companies were all heavily financed and backed by venture capitalists, hedge funds, and investment banks, but if any of them created mainstream products, even 100 shares would provide Mary with what she would consider a fabulous return. Thank goodness we have Carl, Ian, and the Pendulum Group looking after our financial interests. I would hate to see Cheesy, Errol and myself at the whim of venture capitalists, hedge fund managers or investment bankers to bring our knowledge to fruition and hopefully to the benefit of all humanity. It's a good thing Leonardo da Vinci's parents had some cash in the bank and little Wolfgang's parents could afford his first piano lessons. Our clients were interested in our services as part of their larger projects. We were fortunate that Hobart had a robust workforce of skilled labor we could call on for client projects. The University of Melbourne was a great source of smart young minds. The DNA to be cloned could be obtained by cutting it out of the source DNA by digestion with restriction enzymes from a source molecule. That could be accomplished by either polymerase chain reaction or reverse transcription PCR, or even by assembling it from short DNA pieces known as oligonucleotides. Polymerase chain reaction was a laboratory technique used to amplify DNA sequences. The method involved using short DNA sequences called primers to select the portion of the genome to be amplified. The temperature of the sample was repeatedly raised and lowered to help a DNA replication enzyme copy the target DNA sequence. The technique could produce 1 billion copies of the target sequence in just a few hours. Those methods all required that the DNA source was sufficiently free of contaminants that could potentially inhibit the enzyme activities. Polymerase chain reaction was the foundation of my PhD research topic. It's an important step in our overall plans to balance the world's pendulums, but just a creak when viewed on a much longer map leading to our convergence or destiny. Albert had explained as much of our journey as he had seen to Magda that night in Australia several years ago. I wondered if Albert had had any more dreams recently. With my daydreaming over, my thoughts turned to endonucleases, which were enzymes that could cleave the phosphodiester bond within a polynucleotide chain. Some of them have no regard to sequence when cutting DNA, but many others do so only at specific nucleotide sequences. Dick would say we were in sniper mode. Sniper group were restriction endonucleases or restriction enzymes as distinguished from exonucleases, which cut the ends of recognition sequences and not the middle portion. Some exoendonucleases display both functions. Restriction enzymes are endonucleases from eubacteria and archaea that recognize a specific DNA sequence. The restriction site is the nucleotide sequence that is recognized for cleavage by a restriction enzyme, and it's usually a palindromic sequence of 4 to 6 nucleotides. Cleaving is performed unevenly, leaving single-stranded or sticky ends, which can use hybridization to reconnect. The phosphodiester bonds of the fragments can be joined through DNA ligase when they've been paired. Every restriction endonuclease that's known attacks a different restriction site, which means there are hundreds of restriction sites for hundreds of restriction endonucleases. Sweet, let's map them and have Cheesy write the software to target them. The origin of the DNA has no impact on the ability of the DNA fragments cleave to join together in a new recombinant DNA, formed by the joining the genes in new combinations. 3 categories of restriction endonucleases exist, categorized based on how they work. Used in genetic engineering to create recombinant DNA, they can be introduced into different cells of bacterial, plant or animal origin. They can also be used in synthetic biology. Cas9 or CRISPR-associated protein 9 is a notable example of an endonuclease. It's a protein that plays an important role in the immunological defense of certain bacteria against DNA viruses. It's best known for its uses in genetic engineering. Type 1 restriction enzymes are capable of cleaving random sites of approximately 1,000 base pairs from the recognition sequence, while type 2 enzymes are simpler and don't require ATP as an energy source, unlike type 1. Type 3 cleaved the DNA at approximately 25 base pairs from the recognition sequence and, like type 1, require ATP. Endonucleases contribute to DNA repair. The incision of DNA at AP sites is catalyzed by AP endonuclease, which readies DNA for excision, repair synthesis, and DNA ligation. In biochemistry and molecular genetics, an AP or an abasic site is a location in DNA that has neither a purine nor a pyrimidine base, either spontaneously or due to DNA damage. A polymerase is an enzyme that synthesizes long chains of polymers or nucleic acids. DNA polymerase and RNA polymerase are used to assemble DNA and RNA molecules by copying a DNA template strand using base pairing interactions or RNA by half-ladder replication. A DNA polymerase from the thermophilic bacterium, Thermus aquaticus, is used in the polymerase chain reaction, which may be template-dependent or template-independent. Terminal deoxynucleotidyl transferase is also known to have template-independent and template-dependent activities. I remember Errol asking, is a transferase a class of enzyme one that catalyzes the transfer of specific functional groups like methyl or glycosyl from donor molecule to acceptor molecule, and I replied, yes, they're involved in hundreds of different biochemical pathways throughout biology and are integral to some of life's most important processes. Traditional cloning by restriction endonuclease digestion can use any of a number of different source DNA types. Genomic DNA can be digested with a restriction enzyme and cloned into a compatible vector site to produce a library of different inserts, all from the same source DNA. DNA already cloned into one vector can be transferred or subcloned to a new recipient vector by cutting out the DNA with restriction enzymes and cloning into the corresponding sites of the second vector. They did this frequently to facilitate protein expression or transcription of RNA, when not possible from the original vector. We spent a solid week looking over the property for tiger tracks and setting our camera traps for the surveillance team, which usually included 2 or 3 of Uncle Arta's friends and Uncle Arthur. Their chairs and tables were empty beer boxes waiting to be returned and refilled, but the fridge was never empty. "It's thirsty work watchin' for these little buggers," Uncle Arthur would say. Mary, Errol's mom, was a constant figure in Hobart but did manage to get away to Sydney with Mabel and Gordon for a few weeks. She liked the cosmopolitan feel of Sydney that she said she didn't get back home in Hobart. Uncle Artis says she still talks about her trip to England to anyone who will listen. "You'd think she met the bloody Queen, for God's sake." Eventually Errol and I were able to get back to Hobart and set about the tasks that were piling up on us. We each had projects on the go for our PhDs, but we also had several clients looking to ramp up their business requirements. In this industry, being the first is essential because most times second doesn't even finish the race. Our first month was spent catching up on work Mary had left out for us to be done before Christmas, or else we'd only have coal in our stockings. Errol had some difficulty in pushing clients back until Cheesy's return because they were anxious to advance their projects with millions of dollars invested, and even threatened to go elsewhere. Although Errol was polite, he knew Cheesy was worth waiting for and made it abundantly clear to the client, who reluctantly had to concede. Cheesy had told us, back in the day, full genome shotgun sequencing for small base pair sets under 10,000 benefited from pairwise end sequencing. Dick would have called the double-barrel shotgun sequencing. As sequencing projects took on longer and more complicated genomes, multiple groups began to realize that useful information could be obtained by sequencing both ends of a fragment of DNA. Sequencing both ends of the same fragment and keeping track of the paired data was more cumbersome than sequencing a single end of 2 distinct fragments, especially considering the computing power available at the time. The knowledge that the 2 sequences were oriented in opposite directions and were about the length of a fragment apart from each other was valuable information when reconstructing the sequence of the original target fragment. Remember, they are all palindromes. Cheesy went on to say, in Sanger, fragments of DNA were separated by an electric field applied to a gel or fluid. Then in capillary sequencing a long acrylic tube was used. By dipping the capillary and an electrode into a solution of the sample, the DNA fragments migrated to the end of the capillary. The small diameter allowed for extremely high electric fields, for rapid separation of DNA sequencing fragments. It's still too expensive and takes too long for commercial purposes today though. Errol indicated that he had seen this process applied, but it was not something I had witnessed. He added, in the Human Genome Project, large facilities of automated machines generated 1,000 nucleotides per second, around the clock. With related techniques, an isolated gene could be altered and transferred back into the germline to become a functional and heritable part of the organism's genome. Can you imagine the ability to manipulate DNA with precision in a test tube or an organism? Cheesy went on to say, in the last 15 years capillary sequencing has been displaced by high-throughput sequencing technologies like Illumina DICE sequencing, pyrosequencing, and SMRT sequencing. Errol asked, which one of those is currently the best, or are you going to create the new best? Cheesy smiled and continued, those technologies employ the basic shotgun strategy, namely, parallelization and template generation by way of genome fragmentation. Illumina DICE sequencing is used to determine the series of base pairs in DNA and is currently owned by Illumina. The sequencing method is based on reversible dye-terminators that enable the identification of single nucleotides as they're washed over DNA strands. It can also be used for whole genome and region sequencing, transcriptome analysis, metagenomics, small RNA discovery, methylation profiling, and genome-wide protein-nucleic acid interaction analysis. "You're boggling my mind, mate," Errol said. I had to agree, yet we were supposed to be the biologists, not Cheesy. Through osmosis, Cheesy could absorb information like water to a sponge. I also disagreed with Marius, because I knew Cheesy was just as good at synthesizing that information as anyone. He just had preferential directions. Again, Cheesy smiled and continued, pyrosequencing determines the order of nucleotides based on a principle known as sequencing by synthesis because the sequencing is performed by detecting the nucleotide incorporated by a DNA polymerase. Pyrosequencing relies on light detection based on a chain reaction when pyrophosphate is released. I'm sure you know when a nucleotide is incorporated into a growing DNA or RNA strand by a polymerase, pyrophosphate is released. We both did know that, but we're both seeing it from Cheesy's perspective of gaining understanding from it happening rather than why it was happening. A polymerase is an enzyme that synthesizes long chains of polymers or nucleic acids. DNA polymerase and RNA polymerase are used to assemble DNA and RNA molecules. I noted. That's how it gets the name pyrosequencing. Cheesy said. The lengths of individual reads of DNA sequence are in the neighborhood of 300 to 500 nucleotides, which is half of those obtainable with the chain termination method. SMRT sequencing is probably my favorite at the moment. Single-molecule real-time sequencing is known as a parallelized single-molecule DNA sequencing method. It uses a zero-mode waveguide. A single DNA polymerase enzyme is affixed at the bottom of a ZMW with a single molecule of DNA as a template. You did say ZMW, not BMW, right? Can you explain what a ZMW is for us? That's not a biological term I'm aware of. Errol asked. A zero-mode waveguide is an optical waveguide or physical structure that guides electromagnetic waves in the optical spectrum. Think optical fiber. Optical waveguides can be classified according to their geometry, such as planar, strip, or fiber waveguides. They can also be classified by their mode structure as being either single-mode or multi-mode. Waveguides can even be defined by their refractive index distribution being either step or gradient and material like glass, polymer, or semiconductor. This is all information that became extremely important when I was working with Florin and Dr. Ross on the Tesla stuff. In physics, the wavelength is the spatial period of a periodic wave or when that wave's shape repeats. The ZMW guides light energy into a volume that is small in all dimensions compared to the wavelength of the light. The zero-mode waveguide is made possible by creating circular or rectangular nanoapertures using a focused ion beam. The focused ion beam is an instrument that looks like a scanning electron microscope, but it uses a focused beam of ions instead. An illuminated observation volume is created that is small enough to observe only a single nucleotide of DNA being incorporated by DNA polymerase. Each of the 4 DNA bases is attached to one of 4 different fluorescent dyes. When a nucleotide is incorporated by the DNA polymerase, the fluorescent tag is cleaved off and diffuses out of the observation area of the ZMW where its fluorescence is no longer observable. A detector detects the fluorescent signal of the nucleotide incorporation and the base call is made according to the corresponding fluorescence of the dye. He told us and waited a minute for us to absorb it before continuing. Nanopore sequencing technology is novel and offers portability and potential capability of generating long reads which would be relevant to whole genome sequencing applications. In principle, full genome sequencing can provide the raw nucleotide sequence of an individual organism's DNA, a new direction for single-molecule sequencing. Think about it, he said. Oxford Nanopore Technologies Limited is a UK-based company developing and selling nanopore sequencing products like the portable DNA sequencer they call the Minion. It's used for direct, electronic analysis of single molecules. These guys were right next door to you in the Oxford Science Park when you were in school. Cheesy told us. Errol had heard about this company and their products during his research for lab tools. Their technology is spot on. They have a number of fabulous products that are going to change the direction, focus and access of lots of projects and the science geeks that manage them, as Magda calls us. Cutting edge is costly, mate. Rewards should befit the risk. What's a nanopore? To which Cheesy replied, a pore of nanometer size. It may, for example, be created by a pore-forming protein or as a whole in synthetic materials like silicon or graphene like our VMW. When a nanopore is present in an electrically insulating membrane, it can be used as a single molecule detector. Errol continued, it works by monitoring changes to an electrical current as nucleic acids are passed through a protein nanopore. The resulting signal is decoded to provide the specific DNA or RNA sequence. Nanopore sequencing works on the principle of minute changes in electric current across the nanopore immersed in a conducting fluid with voltage applied when a moving nucleotide passes through it. Of course, Minion, the portable protein nanopore sequencing USB device, has been available for 5 years, but early on they had 3 pore changes, half a dozen chemistry changes, and a software update every couple weeks. Cheesy read from the internet adding, it was used in rapid identification of viral pathogens, monitoring Ebola, as well as environmental monitoring, food safety monitoring and more. With a read rate of 90 nucleotides per second per nanopore and an error rate of 30% during the early phase of its release, they had room to improve. Raw error rates have currently been reduced to between 2 to 13% for various types of DNA sequencing. New versions run at 450 bases per second per nanopore for 10 gigabits data per Minion flow cell. Errol noted, more recently, the R10 pore has been developed with a different aperture. It has different readout characteristics, which can even overcome homopolymer sequences. The GridIO NX5 is a desktop device which processes up to 5 Minion flow cells and enables generation of up to 100 gigabits of data per run. Then there is Flongle, an adapter for Minion or GridION that enables direct, real-time DNA sequencing, or cDNA sequencing on smaller, single-use flow cells. The Promoth ION is a high-throughput device containing channels for 144,000 nanopores compared to Minion's measly 512. Other products are in development and spin-off companies are popping up here and there to support and extend the platform. Methods for analyzing sequencing data are being developed and refined, and that's where Marjolian comes in. She's familiar with all these products and the current research supporting this technology. Cheesy noted. Errol then said, I'm not much of a computer geek, but those numbers sound huge for most computers, like 100 gigabits or even terabytes of information to be manipulated and analyzed. Cheesy gave us a bit of a history lesson in computers to put things in perspective. Back in the day, computing was the realm of the IBM System 360 mainframe computer. That was the realm of big data in the day, and it spoke languages like Fortran, COBOL and PL1, which all ran on the IBM System 360 operating system. People scheduled time months in advance to have their programs run on the computer like they wait in line today for big nuclear reactors around the world. Eventually smaller computers appeared on the scene running on the AS400 platform under a Unix operating system which allowed multiple users to have terminals connected to mini computers. They, in turn, could communicate with Mr. Big, the IBM mainframe. For local office needs, a word processing machine was created by Dr. Wang and referred to as the Wang word processor. A basic machine to replace the typewriter. As with the Avro airplane, Canada had an entry in this field as well, known as the AES data machine, which Cheesy would have said was the best word processor. IBM had already launched their personal microcomputer featuring the Intel 8088 processor with a mighty 512K of RAM memory, but it lacked software applications to run on it. Programs required an operating system platform they could attach themselves to. That's when IBM hired an outside consultant by the name of Bill to create PC-DOS for them. They would then have a platform that would allow developers to create software for their computers and hopefully only their computers. Apple, who had focused on the Motorola 64000 processor, decided to write their own operating system and keep it in-house and remain proprietary. In retrospect, it was the only thing that kept them alive. Once Mr. Bill finished with the PC-DOS version of his operating system, he passed it over to IBM and then immediately released his MS-DOS version of the same product. This allowed anyone with a motherboard and a Phoenix ROM BIOS chip to build their own computer clone which could run the same application software as the IBM computers. The market exploded. I wonder what the development costs of MS-DOS were to Mr. Bill, or did IBM pick up most of the bill and none of the intellectual property rights? Whatever they were, it surely gave rise to one of the highest return on investments ever recorded in human history for Mr. Bill. At least since Isabella took a chance on young Christopher. Computers under any version of DOS could only run one application at a time, and that eventually became a bottleneck for power users. Finally, with Windows 3.1, the promise of multitasking was delivered, and users found themselves running more than one program simultaneously. Windows also finally brought the mouse to the Intel world as an input device from the Motorola world. From their computers connected to local area networks to communicate with each other within a corporate structure, and eventually wider area networks and bulletin boards begot the internet through the university crowd. Now data can move around the world in large streams, but we still need large computers like the Cray to execute applications that manage databases with billions of fields, billions of records, and terabyte memory requirements. We weren't back in Hobart more than a week when Carl came up with another of his brilliant strategies in conference called Cheesy and I, together with the Jacks, Uncle Sandu, Darla, Magda, and Krista. Uncle Sandu and I have been taking a look at an opportunity in the restaurant business. Carl said. Love Jack in Box. Uncle Sandu exclaimed in the background. And he turned to Marius and whispered loud enough for us to hear, "The fries are fresh cut," and Marius put his hand on his head and nodded. We began to buy blocks of corporate Jack-in-the-Box shares, as well as acquiring several franchises for the Salton Sea Motel complex. The corporation has no desire to expand outside of North America, so we're negotiating the European and Asian franchise rights at the moment, while they're considered worthless. Why, you ask? And everyone shouted yes. Because we're going to embark on the most spectacular saturation advertising campaign the world has ever seen for Jack in the Box, featuring the One-Eyed Jacks. Uncle Sandu added, they think 1,200 locations is a lot. Wait until they see how many we build in China. Carl outlined some of the ideas that the creative people had come up with for commercials. In the first one, the Jacks saved JIB from the rival burger chain's burger-headed minions who are after the secret recipe for the new One-Eyed Jack's Volcano Burger. Uncle Sandu added, "It's a good deal, you get fries and a drink. Drive through." Which made everyone laugh. "Who's JIB?" I asked and Marius piped in, "That's what Cheesy calls the ping-pong ball-headed suit-wearing clown that represents corporate Jack-in-the-Box. He calls him that because of the way Uncle Sandu refers to him as Jack-in-Box. The second one is probably going to be a motorcycle chase where the burger-headed minions have JIB on the back of their bike and are trying to escape the pursing one-eye Jacks. It will be a typical motorcycle chase through traffic, buildings, over the sidewalks, and every time JIB gets smacked against something so that by the time they finally save him, he's had the crap beat out of him. In another version, JIB's been pushed off a skyscraper roof and is falling, so the Jacks swing out from buildings like Spider-Man and grab him by a foot. As he's hanging upside down, an extraordinary amount of stuff falls out of his pockets, some of which is quite embarrassing for young JIB. Lorenzo and I will have to make a few of own versions for the internet. What could a little bugger like JIB have in his pockets that might embarrass him? Cheesy wondered. Carl continued, "They have a future series they're planning where the protagonist is a white-haired, glasses-wearing, goateed military type selling chicken burgers. Who knows, maybe the taco-pushing dog is going to make a comeback. With any luck, this could run for years and the Jacks will earn huge royalties as well as upfront fees and stock options for each one. Eat your heart out, Mr. Toxic." Carl ended the call by telling us he had already begun to procure franchises for the Salton Sea area and California in general for us all. Distributing the stocks and franchises around a group of names avoided the attention that large block purchases could attract. Even though nothing was technically illegal, the less scrutiny, the better. Both Errol and I were ready for a trip to the Salton Sea by the time June was on us. Cheesy wasn't back yet from Moldavia, where he said things were going swimmingly well, which was a phrase I hadn't heard him use before, but I knew where he got it from. Ian had recently been to Moldavia and spent some time with the Tesla people, Florin, and Dr. Roz. I would imagine the Baroness as well, although he did not specifically mention that. He would have visited Cheesy for sure. By the time Uncle Artis got us to the airport and we made our way through customs, we were glad to have a snooze on the plane on our way to San Diego. Errol and I had both packed light because we figured it was going to be more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the desert and we needed some new togs. The metric translation said hot, very hot, and new warm weather clothes were definitely called for because fashion was not our friend. Even when it's warm in Tasmania, we need to have our snake protectors on as well as gloves and be covered everywhere. Errol reminded me there were snakes at the Salton Sea too. Cheesy is always almost naked in the pictures from the Salton Sea, no matter what time of day it is. I don't think we're gonna need more than swim-in trunks, mate," Errol said. "Perhaps a fashionable chapeau." As always on our summer trips, we simply dialed a number on arrival, and someone was sent to pick us up. This time it was Uncle Sandu who answered, and he said he would be sending a car for us in about an hour when the rest of the group coming in today were due to arrive. Uncle Sandu let us know that Cheesy was coming from Moldavia and we knew he would be returning with us to Taz after the trip to the Salton Sea. His work with Florin and Dr. Roz had reached a stage where he could support it remotely. The Celtradats were probably already at the sea, so most likely Uncle Sandu was referring to Sandy and Rick as the people we were waiting for. Dr. Ben couldn't make this trip due to commitments with Ian at the Windhaven Medical Center and new anti-venom facility. Dr. Sue had ongoing projects she couldn't leave and had just returned from a short vacation with Dick in Paris. I knew Dick was coming on this trip, at least for some of the time, but I didn't know when exactly, so it surprised me when he drove up in a big van to pick us up at the airport. Sandy and Rick were just getting through customs, so we piled in the van with what little luggage we had, and Dick headed south to the Mexican border on our way to the Gulf of California, as we'd done once before. This time we were going to stay at Dick's father's house that he'd built in San Felipe, right on the Gulf. Dick told us it was some of the best fishing in the world just off San Felipe. You can catch anything in the Sea of Cortez or Gulf of California, whatever you want to call it. We crossed the Mexican border at Tecate to meet up with Highway 20, which allowed us to connect to Highway 5. The Baja Peninsula was a desolate place at this time of year, but I thought it was probably just the lull before the storm. This route took us past Mexicali on the way to San Felipe, so we knew the Laguna Salada could not be far away. It took less than 2 hours to get to Mexicali, and as we drove south, we could look across at the Laguna Salada with water in it this time. It was dark, but we could see the reflection of lights in the crystal-clear night sky under a full moon. I guess this lake won't be drying out anytime soon. Dick gave us a little background on the area as we drove through. Mexicali is the capital city of the Mexican state of Baja California, with about 1 million people in the greater Mexicali area. My father says that should double over the next 5 years. The economy was agricultural, but then they all became maquiladoras. I asked what that term meant, and he said, a maquiladora is a low-cost factory in Mexico owned by a foreign corporation, usually from the US, but not exclusively. Factories are located near the border, and Mexicali is perfect. Duty-free factories import parts from the US, assemble them, and then return them to the United States as finished products. International companies like Honeywell, GKN Aerospace, Kellogg's, Gulfstream, UTC Aerospace Systems, SunPower, Rockwell Collins, LG Electronics, National Oilwell Varco, Mitsubishi, Autolite, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Robert Bosch, and Goodrich Corporation have all built maquiladora plants in Mexicali. Dick told us, a gallon of Mexican sweat must not be worth as much as a gallon of American sweat. Sandy observed, and we all cringed. Dick continued, the Mexicali Valley was one of the largest and most fertile valleys in Mexico, with more than 50 different crops grown in the valley, very much like the Imperial Valley on the U.S. side of the border is today. National and international industries take advantage of tax-free status for industry by building large plants to assemble their products with discounted labor. The valley is a primary source of water for the largest irrigation district in Mexico, with the city guaranteed an annual quantity of 1,500,000 acre-feet from the Colorado River, but a proposed concrete lining in the United States on the All-American Canal would cut off billions of leaked gallons of water, which is currently used to irrigate crops in Mexicali. It seems Dick's father was averting another disaster, along with the toxic playa clouds the Salton Sink could generate when dried out. Rick told us that there were rumors of Aztec mines that collected mercury for use in some of their underground maps of the world. Mercury was used to represent the water in those dreamlike settings that were probably experienced in a state of intoxication fueled by intentionally ingested drugs. There's an exclusion area around Cerro Prieto, but there are other conspiracy theories I'll save for a bonfire story some night. Lance has told me some great stories of this area that connect all the way up into Arizona. He informed us. Several hours of traveling south along Highway 5 delivered our first views of the Gulf of California for the second time in our lives. This time, it was impossible not to notice the changes already taking place at this end of the water's journey. In the cooler evening, the desert was full of light and new businesses being built everywhere. Signs advertising what was going to be available popped up beside signs of what was currently available and what was no longer available. Dick told us of a large desalination plant that was exporting truckloads of water to San Diego along the same route we just traveled, but from a destination much closer to the other end of the Laguna Salada before it enters the canal and crosses the U.S. border. A pipeline is in the works, but that's still a couple years away. My father will have the contract on that, you can bet. We reached San Felipe, our destination on the Gulf of California, in the Mexican state of Baja California. As the bay came into view, Dick informed us in his best tour bus voice, the Bay of San Felipe is only 3 meters above sea level. At low tide, the water can recede as much as 2 km inland, so you'll see lots of docks that seem to extend too far out into the Gulf. They have one of the largest tidal bores in the world, partly due to the Colorado River Delta to the north. 7-meter tides expose a kilometer of ocean floor. It's spectacular, and my dad has the best place on the coast, as you can imagine. My sister is looking for a 4th husband, so Dad will give her a place down here as a wedding present. Cheesy read off the internet. In San Felipe, they call the Gulf of California the Sea of Cortez. 400 years ago, Hernando de Alarcón and Domingo Castillo explored the region, making the first detailed map and giving San Felipe its original name, Santa Catalina. Those kinds of details can be extremely important when investigating Spanish treasure maps. Rick noted. Richard told me he's a whiz with ancient Castilian. He has interest in some monk or religious guy by the name of Father Eusebio Quino, and asked me to check into a couple of libraries in town here for him. I told him I would. We pulled off the main road and headed toward the sea. Even from a kilometer away, his father's house rose against the skyline and made its presence felt. The land was flat and the house was huge, especially lit up like the 4th of July in the darkness of the Gulf. Within 100 yards of the house, the path was lit on either side by huge fancy wrought iron light standards. Dick pulled up to the front door on a circular drive and announced, "Everyone out. It's time to party." This was a typical American mansion in a location more befitting a hacienda. The massive entranceway had a monstrous spiral staircase leading to a balcony over the grand entrance. I thought that would be a perfect spot for Dick's dad to address his entourage. On the left of the entrance was the parlor for pleasure, on the right was the study for business. Several people came out to take our luggage and welcome us to the home of Senator Wadden, which took us by surprise because we thought he was a governor. Dick told us later that he finished 2 terms as governor and was ousted by the party from the presidential race in favor of someone else he didn't mention, but I'm sure Cheesy had already found out who. Grandfather was pissed and has vowed to even the score someday. My dad settled for the senator's job and looks at it as early retirement. Normally he's here fishing, but he had to go to Mexico City to meet some politicians. And Cheesy quipped, "Oh, is today Grease the Palms Day?" We settled into our splendid accommodations and then got back together at the back of the house, which led down the beach to the water. Halfway down to the water's edge, a large fire pit and a ring of Adirondack-style chairs pointed their occupants toward the sunrise we'd have to wait about 8 hours to witness. We were patient that first night as Dick got the fire blazing, and we simply relaxed in the warmest breeze I'd experienced, even considering Africa and India. It gave me the sensation of floating. Dick cooked some of the largest T-bone steaks I'd ever seen. He placed them on the grill over the fire pit beside the baked potatoes and grilled peppers. We washed down the feast with ice-cold Dos Equis, a local lager beer. It was no wonder we didn't notice the arrival of the Celtradats until they strolled onto the beach. Marius, Marian, Darla, Magda, and Krista picked up the pace as they saw we saw them and started waving. We met in the middle like a huge scrum on the rugby field, falling all over each other in the sand. That's when the party began in earnest. Dick produced a second meal for the Celtradats, and while they were getting settled in, Cheesy asked Sandy, "Do you have an appropriate story for us tonight, Sandy G?" To which Sandy replied, "Since we've apparently found a Brigu scroll, perhaps we should learn a little more about him and his interests, or at least the secrets from this world or others which he may possess. Dick threw a couple of large logs on the fire as Sandy began his tale. This is the story of the testing of the Tremorti. Sheezy gasped, "Oh my, not the Tremorti." The three big guys and the girls laughed at his antics. They'd all been big Cheesy fans since they were teenagers together. Sandy continued, "Yes, many great sages gathered at the bank of the river Sarasvati to participate in a Mahayagya, which is a very high Vedic mantra needed to decide which of the trinity of gods, Vishnu, Brahma, or Shiva, is preeminent. That god would be worthy of being the pradanta, or master of that particular yajna, as this was not an uncommon event." Krista recapped, "So we've got a bunch of holy guys having an annual popularity contest for their favorite god? Tough crowd tonight, Sandy G." Sheezy observed. Sandy continued, "All the great and amazing sages alive at the time gathered at the predetermined site. They all agreed the task of testing each of the Tremorti would fall to Maharishi Bhrigu. The first stop on Bhrigu's tour was to make a house call on Brahma. When he arrived, Brahma was reciting the Vedas and spending a little time with his lovely wife, Sarasvati. Therefore, he completely ignored the arrival of Bhrigu, who then got angry and started to insult his father. Dick stopped him with a question, "Is Brahma Maharishi Bhrigu's father?" Big detail there, Sandy. Everyone's knowledge of Hindu mythology was growing thanks to Sandy's stories as well as our yoga training. Bhrigu was a rishi in Hinduism. He was one of the 7 great sages known as the Saptarshis, one of the many Prajapati or facilitators of creation required to be created by Brahma at the start of each new cycle known as a yuga. Bhrigu is considered a Manasaputra, or mind-born son of Brahma. That makes him more than just a ball of energy thrown to the earth with a chunk of DNA. Bhrigu was a compatriot of and lived during the time of Manu, the Hindu progenitor of humanity. A fine specimen of a man, if I do say so myself. If I remember my Hindu timeframe correctly, we are currently in the 7th kalpa of 14 kalpas. Within each kalpa there are 71 chatur yugas, which each consist of the 4 yuga periods before they are flushed and restarted. Sandy taught us the world goes through the 4 yugas, Krita, Trita, Dwapara, and Kali, as man declines to his own self-destruction. I knew that the current universe was to be ruled by the 7th Manu named Vaibhasvata. He was the king of Dravida before the event known as the Great Flood. Warned of the flood by Matsya, the fish avatar of Vishnu, Vaibhasvata built a boat to carry the Vedas, his family, and the 7 sages to safety. His first mate was a young fellow named Noah, I think. I thought to myself, Maharishi Bhrigu was a fine man, just misunderstood." Sandy continued, "Brahma also got angry and, in fear, Bhrigu left for Kailash, the home of Shiva. When he arrived, Lord Shiva was having a conversation with Parvati, his significant other. Shiva was infuriated at the intrusion, but was calmed by his consort, Parvati, whom, as we all know, calms him so well by stroking his ego. It's a good thing he wasn't having a Kali moment that day," I said. The Maharishi then ran to Vaikuntha, the home of Vishnu, trying to find him. To add insult to insult, Vishnu wasn't able to see Bhrigu because he was asleep on his Sheshanaga. Again! "You lazy sot," he thought. Bhrigu kicked Vishnu on the chest to wake him up because he was enraged that Vishnu was constantly asleep on the Sheshanaga. Vishnu woke up, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, greeted Bhrigu, and started massaging his feet, asking him if he had hurt his foot by kicking him in the chest. In the process of massaging his foot, Vishnu destroyed the third eye of Bhrigu that was on his foot and symbolized his ignorance and his ego. Once the eye was destroyed, Bhrigu became aware of his egotistical outbursts with extreme prejudice. He begged forgiveness of Vishnu, who readily forgave him. "Relax, Brigu, I forgive you. No worries," Vishnu told him. "I didn't know Vishnu was an Aussie," Errol said, and we all laughed at Sandy's interpretation. Sandy continued, "That made Brigu declare Vishnu the greatest god amongst the triumvirate of gods." Compassion? That's why Vishnu's the best. Many today would see compassion as weakness, Dick noted skeptically. A similar theme can be found in the story of Tirupati, where Brigu curses Brahma to not be worshipped, Shiva to be worshipped as the lingam, and an angered Lakshmi, cursing the Brahmins, to achieve wealth only by hard work. Brigu needed a break from pissing everyone off, so he decided to write a book on astrology which he called the Brigu Samhita. Sandy noted and paused for a drink. Brigu collected birth charts and wrote full life predictions for a growing entourage. The Brigu Samhita was the first book on predictive astrology. The book was already well known to Darla, Magda, and Krista. Richard was planning to spend a month with the Celtradats in Moldavia to understand the astrology revealed in the Sanskrit writings he had translated to that point. The date could play an important part in some of their rituals by making sure the planetary bodies were in alignment. While much of the Brigu Samhita was destroyed over the ages, a few parts of the book are said to still exist in Hoshiarpur, a city in the Punjab. Richard told me that he may have located a fellow who has a page or two for sale. Rick and I will be checking that out when we return to India, Sandy told us. The fire continued to rage and we continued to consume massive quantities of Mexican beer while we listened to Magda play her guitar and Krista play the flute for a little while longer. The sun breached the surface of the horizon before we eventually climbed back up the beach to our respective accommodations within Kasawadin for as much of a snooze as we could get. My head barely reached the pillow before ceasing to be awake. The senator's staff laid out a nice buffet breakfast for us in the morning, and once we consumed it we migrated down to the beach to spread our yoga mats on the sand facing into the morning sun and capturing the breeze bellowing in off the Gulf. Sandy had promised to extend our yoga skills on this trip, so we were all anxious to ramp up some of our deteriorating regimens before he tried whipping us into shape. San Felipe didn't exactly fit the stereotype of a Mexican village of city squares filled with fountains and Spanish churches like a Humphrey Bogart movie. Marius and I decided to join Rick on his trip to the libraries and private cellars, while Marion and Cheesy went fishing with Sandy and Dick. Darla, Magda, and Krista had their own agenda and went whale watching. Before we left, Marius took me aside and told me about a map he had found in a cave on his Salton Sea property in the canyon area. He was anxious to see if he could find out more about the map at one of these libraries, including who the author may be. This type of treasure hunt intrigued me more than the whale watching and a lot more than the big game fishing Dick and his crew were planning. Rick was looking for information on Father Eusebio Kino, who was credited with rediscovering the Baja California Peninsula 200 years after the original invaders moved on to rape richer pastures. Richard told me that his name is sometimes found in its Latin version, Eusebius Franciscus Chinus. That's a very important detail when looking for maps and documents such as these. At least according to Richard, who seems to spend a lot of time looking for Catholic treasure, for a Protestant minister. I saw Rick consult a book that he liked to carry and make notes in. He had been given the addresses of 3 libraries or private collectors in the San Felipe area. Richard said even though these are libraries, there may be an opportunity to buy the odd document. Again, his idea is if the document includes a clue, why leave it behind for someone else to find? He probably has an awesome collection of this kind of stuff. Yeah, he's a greedy little pack rat, I confirmed. He looked at his notes and added, Father Kino arrived in the Pimeria Alta area of Mexico and established his first mission in a river valley in the mountains of Sonora before traveling across northern Mexico into present-day California and Arizona. Right through the Sultan's sink, I thought. I could see this information was registering with Marius, and we both could feel there was something more to all this. In those days, there were ancient trading routes established 1,000 years prior by the natives that existed here at the time. Father Kino's expeditions on horseback covered over 50,000 square miles, which he mapped extensively. His maps provided the most accurate details of the region for more than 150 years after his death. Many of today's geographical features, including the Colorado River, were first named by Kino. Richard said he practiced other crafts and was reportedly an expert astronomer and mathematician as well. I'm not sure what Richard's interest is in this guy. I was just told to look for documents with his name on them or anything from that period for that matter. You know Richard, he probably thinks there's a shitload of Spanish gold and jewels to be found on one of these maps. The first two locations turned out to be less than what we were expecting, and I'm sure would have been a disappointment to Richard. We probably would have seen one of those not-so-clergy looks on his face. The third location proved to be something quite different, as it was owned by Samuel Gomez Esq, a self-named collector extraordinaire of all things Central American, according to him, and his museum-quality collection backed up that statement. His property took us back in time through the Aztecs and Mayans, and even further back as he pointed out relics from the Toltecs and Olmecs. A collection is never permanent. For a collection to grow, things must be exchanged so that new additions may be acquired. Is there something in particular I can help you with? Samuel asked Rick, who produced a list of names in several languages that Richard had given him, and he passed it to Samuel. Books or artifacts for any of these names. Give me a few moments and I will check through my collection. Browse through some of these fine artifacts while you wait. That's truly the only way to appreciate what transpired in this very spot more than 1,000 years ago, maybe two. He was absolutely right, as we became mesmerized by artifacts like the huge round heads that he had displayed in his series. Each was distinctly different, as if it represented a specific person that we should recognize. Some even seemed to have expressions that indicated they had a message to convey. This was an art form that communicated information of the realm to the people. I whispered to Marius, how did they get the rock to take these forms and yet not have the tools required to do it? These guys could have been in the Cel-Trottat circus performing this trick, and he had to agree it was mind-boggling. I can only imagine something this intricate was molded and not carved or chiseled. When Samuel returned, he had a list of 3 items and showed it to Rick. Rick turned to us and said, "Give me a minute while I call Richard to see if he wishes to negotiate with Samuel." Marius and I waited patiently for Rick to complete Richard's business, and we left with the items in tow, as well as several artifacts that we acquired for ourselves or gifts for the others. We arrived back at Dick's father's house to find everyone had already returned from their excursions and were on the beach beginning the evening party. Dick hailed me over to a table where he was sitting with a fellow dressed in bathing attire and sipping a drink. "This is a friend of my dad's, Juan Pedro Gonzalez, the Minister of Agriculture here in Mexico." Before he could introduce me, I said in a startled voice, "Juan Pedro?" "Schaffhausen Juan Pedro," and he simply put his hand over his mouth in disbelief. "How on earth do you two know each other?" Dick asked in amazement, and I said, "We were roommates at school in Switzerland when we were very young." "This is unbelievable." Dick left us alone for a few moments to get reacquainted under the guise of needing to do some party prep. "I remember Juan Pedro, but where did the Gonzalez come from?" "In this part of the world, if you look Indian and you speak Spanish, you can buy a citizenship in any country from Mexico to Patagonia for the right price. A little more of the right price, and you can buy yourself a nice political career. Why the Mexican Minister of Agriculture? And he replied, I have a sister who is a Bolivian Mother Superior and a brother who is due to be the next president of Brazil. Do you remember the last thing I said to you when we parted company? Let's meet again after we've changed the world, and he replied, perhaps we just met a little earlier than I expected. At that point Dick returned, and the conversation turned jovial as we joined in with the fun that was going on closer to the water. Before he left, Juan and I managed to find some additional time to talk alone. He told me, when I left Switzerland, I ended up in Bolivia where my father spent his initial time in exile. My father read books and documents written by Ernesto Guevara, who was an Argentine Marxist revolutionary, physician, author, guerrilla leader, diplomat, and military theorist. He was a major figure in the Cuban Revolution. My father wanted to create a world where the native South Americans could live without the oppression they had felt since the Spanish first arrived on that fateful day more than 500 years ago. 500 years is a teardrop in the lake of time for our people. My father would tell me. He met with Daniel Ortega and became part of the Sandinista organization in Nicaragua. That was not a popular administration in U.S. eyes, and eventually it had to be removed. Daniel Ortega, however, was not and is a Nicaraguan politician serving as president of Nicaragua today, although amid a great deal of scandal. Is your message, change can happen? I asked. He continued, my sister is in Bolivia for a reason. If you know South America at all, you would have heard stories from Bolivia and the epic quest for independence and freedom for its indigenous people. These people have been abused since the time of the Spanish conquistadors arriving from Cusco and Asunción to take control of that region in the 16th century. Under Spanish colonial rule, Bolivia was known as Upper Peru and administered by the Royal Audiencia of Charcas. 100 years ago, after a 15-year war resulted the creation of the Bolivian Republic, named for their liberator Simon Bolivar, occurred. The cultures of the indigenous peoples of Bolivia were developed in the high-altitude setting of the Altiplano with low oxygen levels, poor soils, and extreme weather patterns. Much of the pre-Columbian population was concentrated in the Altiplano valleys of Cochabamba and Chuquisaca. These people lived near Lake Titicaca almost 10,000 years ago. Today they're forced to work in primitive conditions in the mines or feudal estates, denied access to education, economic opportunity, or political participation. Like most economies based on slave labor, it grew impressively, but demands for greater political freedom once again plunged Bolivia into turmoil. The basement of the Ministry of the Interior was known as the Horror Chambers, where more than 2,000 political prisoners were held and tortured. During this period, there were coups, counter-coups, and even caretaker governments. Finally, 30 years ago, General Luis Garcia Meza carried out a ruthless and violent coup to install a government that was notorious for human rights abuses, narcotics trafficking, and economic mismanagement. This was around the time my sister joined the order and began the struggle. My father left for his Central American training with Daniel Ortega at that time as well. Relations with the U.S., which under Carter and Reagan refused to recognize Garcia's government and later even convicted him for his crimes in absentia, were not good to say the least. Hyperinflation reached an annual rate of 24,000% and coined the phrase galloping inflation. Finally, when President Hugo Banzer retired 20 years ago due to lung cancer, it opened up an opportunity for indigenous peoples to enter the political fray. In presidential elections, indigenous leader Evo Morales of the Movement Towards Socialism Party narrowly lost because several days prior to voting, the U.S. ambassador warned the Bolivian electorate that, if they voted for Morales, the US would cut off foreign aid and close its markets to the country. Nice move, US. Morales still received more than 20% of the vote, just a couple points behind the winner. Evo Morales was a former cocalero or cocoa grower who joined with the peasant mine workers to create a voice in Bolivia. My sister was very much part of that struggle. Eventually Evo Morales did become president, and the rights of indigenous peoples have never been stronger since the arrival of the Spanish. I could tell you many stories of how my sister Maria aided the efforts of those who made this happen, providing the resistance necessary to hold it back. He paused for a moment to collect his thoughts and recompose himself, then he continued. Back in Nicaragua, the overthrow and exile of Somoza Debayle made Ortega the leader of the ruling multi-partisan junta of national reconstruction. Ortega pursued a program of nationalization, land reform, wealth redistribution, and the Nicaraguan literacy campaign during his first period in office. My father was a very close advisor to that government, so let me tell you, nothing is ever as it appears. The heart of the world does not beat to an American rhythm. We'll meet again and I'll tell you about Nicaragua and what's currently happening in Brazil. There are hundreds of indigenous cultures that still exist there today. These are the people my brother Rafael is trying to help, or at least to protect, until the world wants help them. And what are you going to do for Mexico? I asked. I've come to Mexico to ensure the opportunities being offered to the natives here are not being given with one hand and taken away with the other. Dick tells me you've seen the factories where Mexican labor's best wage is less than the American minimum wage. We have an opportunity here to create a whole new social order for the indigenous people and return them to a sustainable agrarian lifestyle. Consider this with your own goals, and if they can both be achieved, I would be happy to work with you, my friend. Change can happen, but sometimes the pendulum needs a nudge. That is my message, I think. I agreed to meet with Juan again before I returned to Tasmania, so we exchanged contact information and said our goodbyes. Then I rejoined the party and he left for parts unknown. The next day we took a boat excursion as a group to Consag Island, or Isla Consag as it's known in San Felipe by the locals. Consag lays 20 miles offshore into the Sea of Cortez, about halfway between San Felipe and Puerto Penasco. As we approached, the rock formations majestically rose from below sea level, creating a truly imposing presence in the middle of the sea. Bird droppings lit up the rocks like the snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas. Seals and sea lions lay on the rocks like so many fat chicken breasts baking on a sheet in the oven. They were all over the lower levels of the islands, just a meter out of the water. Marine life was everywhere above and below the surface of this body of water, and I wondered how much of it would end up in the Salton Sea once the water reached its maximum level and minimum salinity. Certainly, no mammals, right? On the trip back to San Felipe, Rick had a few more details to tell us about the mushrooms and tiger connection with Swami Virunda, the disciple of Swami Samka who had guided Lord Andrew and Sir Malcolm Havelock on their journeys. He told us about one of his trips down to the tiger sanctuary that led to a surprising discovery. I think he took joy in revealing details of things he had been sitting on for some time before releasing them for best effect. Perhaps that's a trait he's picking up from Ian. I took a staff from the back door, as I usually do when going on a walk or even a stroll. On this particular day, a local dog became aggressive with me because I smelled like tiger in the clothes that I was wearing. I had to use the staff to ward off the dog, and that's when I realized there was a shift in weight when I swung the staff. Once I had dispelled the dog, I examined the staff and realized it was the hill poplar staff and had a cavity inside that could be exposed by unscrewing the end of it. Inside was a document written in Sanskrit which appeared to reveal the secrets of the poem. Then it made sense that this was the hill poplar which was knowing the way, if this is the formula. What did the paper say? I asked. I don't know, it was written in Sanskrit. Ian decided it was better to bring Richard in to translate it rather than have Swami Virunda interpret it. Having the formula would give the Swami too much essential knowledge of the entire process. The Swami is our source of mycelium and psilocybin to make the tiger connection. Of that, I'm sure. I've learned the path they followed linked through trees which allowed the mycelium to channel energy between colonies of mycelium. The mushroom is just the fruit of the mycelium but will get you extremely high if you consume it. The true underground network of root-like fibers that stretch for miles can create links constructed through the psilocybin experience and your neural network that develops. Two organisms, such as the tiger and the human, while in close contact with each other during several sessions, can develop a link between each other. At least they begin to develop a link and respond system. This leads to a gateway understanding of all the impulses the other organism experiences. At the moment, I'm still a novice. What species of mushroom? I asked. I don't know that yet either. Swami Virunda has me working with the mushrooms and packaging spore bundles for shipment to other shrine sites in India, but the labeling does not make sense to me. One of his missions is to spread this particular species as far and wide as he can. When I asked him why, he simply replied, "Because that is why I am here." I could try and send some to Dr. Ben who might identify it, but I want to earn Swami Virunda's respect and confidence. That requires patience and honesty. As Sandy will tell you, some journeys on the path to enlightenment can take a lifetime. Dr. Ben is our source for the toxins in the blood or saliva of the spider. It may even differ for the male and the female. If it's the correct species, it's necessary for the neural communication links to develop while under the psilocybin experience. I sense that anyway. I didn't know at that time that Rick had begun his own connection with a tiger just as Lord Andrew had with karma and Sir Malcolm with dharma. Sandy knew, because he told me later he did. Rick's tiger was named Destiny. Magda wanted to begin a similar transition with the wolves, but until Rick was successful, no further tests were to be undertaken. She was also hopeful that with the new formula Florin may be able to create an opportunity to add one of the new young wolf pups from the Immortal clan to her personal pets group with peepers. One of Serge and Anastasia's pups that she particularly liked she named Gobi. That was our last day at Casa Wadden, so we had a great massive fire on the beach and a huge party under the full moon set against the calm of the Gulf of California or the Sea of Cortez, whichever you prefer. By the look of the beach in the morning, not many people made it to bed and very few were getting out their yoga mats in favor of hangover remedies. We eventually packed our growing baggage into our massive vehicle and together with the Cel-Trottet limo we headed towards Mexicali to meet up with Juan Pedro Gonzalez and stay at his home for a night on our way back to the Salton Sea. Dick said he called yesterday and asked if we could stop at his home on our way to the Salton Sea. His home was in a suburb of Mexicali located off a road by the name of Tectate Rumorosa Libre in an area where farms were sectioned out in the manner that people could make a living. This was traditional for the indigenous people, so when we arrived at his home, I was not surprised to find a group of hacienda-style adobe buildings focused around water flowing in channels and ponds. Although it was slightly more affluent than the properties around it, it was subtle enough to not be in-your-face affluent. The area around the house was enclosed by a small wall about a meter high. The entire property included an area about half a kilometer by a kilometer. Parked in one corner near the house was a reconditioned school bus with some local images in groups painted on it with bright colors. This was going to be our tour vehicle to explore Mexicali and the Laguna Salada, but not before we indulged in some local tequila shots. Juan Pedro told us a bit about our drink. Tequila is distilled from the blue agave plant, and some would say that the best comes from the city of Tequila in the south of Mexico, but in reality, wherever the plant grows, grab a worm and let's make some tequila, and everyone downed their shots, sucked their lemons, and licked the salt off their hands. Juan introduced us to his family, which included his wife Maria and their 7 children. Until this time, the Jacks had been able to remain unrecognized in Mexico, but Juan's children went hysterical when they were introduced to the one-eyed Jacks and Darla. When I asked Juan how many children he had in Switzerland at the moment, he laughed and said, "These children will have to find their own way to Switzerland." We eventually piled everyone onto the bus, and Juan gave us the guided tour of Mexicali from the front of the bus, broadcasting with a microphone and portable amplifier. As we traveled, Juan spoke of the international companies located here and the products assembled as we passed the plants one by one, like Honeywell, GKN Aerospace, Rockwell Collins, LG Electronics, Mitsubishi, and Goodrich Corporation, which have all built maquiladora plants in the city. I asked Juan why this didn't create opportunities for Mexicans either as skilled labor or in the technology to create competing products. Times are changing in this area, and that may be possible in the future now that the drug cartels have less influence since North American legalization of marijuana. Cocaine traffic from South America is still an issue, but much smaller, at least for now. Juan's wife Maria took over the microphone and told us, the Spanish left this area after a revolt by the Yuma people 250 years ago. After that, the Spanish had little to do with the northeastern corner of the Baja California Peninsula, perceiving it to be an untamable, flood-prone desert delta. Eventually, the Mexican authorities reopened the Sonoran Road and restored peaceful relations with the Yuma people. Passing through another area of Mexicali, she began, in the last century, the Colorado Riverland Company, a U.S.-based company, rented Mexican land to farmers, all of which were foreigners, such as Chinese, East Indians and Japanese. Mexicans were employed only as their seasonal laborers. This situation led to the agrarian conflict known as the Assault on the Lands, in which Mexican land was taken back by Mexicans. The Mexicali Valley became the biggest cotton-producing zone in the country when production reached more than 500,000 parcels a year. Currently, the valley is still one of Mexico's most productive agricultural regions, producing wheat, cotton, and a wide variety of vegetables like asparagus, broccoli, carrots, green onions, lettuce, peas, peppers, radishes, and tomatoes. You will be tasting all of these today before you leave. Maria pointed out one area that was destroyed by a very large magnitude 7.2 earthquake about 10 to 15 years previously, which made me wonder how the change that was being planned would impact something like that. After all, this area was tied into plate tectonics, rifts and faults, and we were about to shift trillions of tons of weight over it. No big deal, right? Juan took over the microphone again as we journeyed to a place he called Silicon Border. It's an empty 9,900-acre development tailored to the needs of high-technology manufacturing and is situated on the outskirts of Mexicali, along the western border of the U.S. and Mexico. The aim was to transform Mexicali into the world's next semiconductor manufacturing center, but it was botched by the government, which gave away $2 million of public money to private hands for the laying of a few streets and lampposts, as you can see here. The similarities with the abandoned Salton Sea towns were startling. We passed a number of sporting sites, malls, churches, and even a bull ring on our way to get a better look at the new, deeper, expanded Laguna Salada. Traveling down Highway 2D, we finally got our first really good view of this expansive body of water known as the Salty Lagoon by the Spanish. Maria began, it's 10 meters below sea level here. This lake was called Hawaymk in the Cocopa language and Haasai in the Kumeyaay language. The lake's shape vaguely resembles a rhombus.
At this point Magda pointed out, the rhombus shape consists of two triangles, one downward known as yin and one upward pointed known as yen, joined together. This geometric symbol represents the inner focus that a human being needs to hold on to their life task during their lifetime on Earth. When you consider a DNA chain where a 3-foot must match with a 5 to keep the symmetry, it makes sense.
Reinstall balance within self between the yin and yen.
Energy that makes up every human being and reflects inner balance into outer world. When the rhombus appears, a significant change occurs in the consciousness of a human being, one that supersedes the limited ego self of the human personality and that acts for the benefit of all people.
Maria was almost overcome as she struggled to retain her balance.
Then she said, "That's so incredible because that's exactly how I feel when I'm here.
I want to help not only my people but everyone. It's a sense of harmony to strive for."
Juan clearly agreed because he shook his head in disbelief.
The rest of the tour seemed almost anticlimactic after Magda's revelation.
The flatness of the exposed lake sediments made it a favored location for recreational driving when it would dry out, but that was one thing the locals were going to forfeit for this progress.
The area was also notorious for dust storms when it was dry as a result of monsoonal thunderstorms during the summer. Flanked by the Sierra de los Cucapa and the Sierra de Juarez mountain ranges, the lake is approximately 60 by 15 kilometers.
Dick said it had been lowered significantly to expand the volume of water available for irrigation and desalination before it passes through to the Salton Sea. Being located at the bottom of a shallow graben linked to the San Andreas Fault, and the East Pacific Rise as part of the Laguna Salada Fault put it in a precarious position from a tectonic perspective. The fault was connected to the Salton Trough Fault, which held a similar depression, notably the Salton Sink, and also where the Baja California earthquake occurred just a decade ago. We finally turned the bus around and headed back to Juan and Maria's place for a huge Mexican feast, with all of their neighbors showing up with food, drink, and musical instruments. Juan's oldest son lit a huge fire and the neighbors were in the final stages of roasting an entire pig when we returned. Tequila made its way around and waves and cheers were generally followed by a beer round or a sangria mug from their Spanish heritage. The food started rolling out as the pig was removed from the sip and carved on a long board that had been set up for just such an event. Maria explained some of the local dishes for us as we filled our plates.
This is a corn salad with avocado, and that is Mexican red rice, chorizo, black bean, and corn salsa. Pozole is normally eaten on special occasions, made with pork and hominy.
The broth is a base made from chili and then garnished with oregano, shredded cabbage, sautéed garlic, lime, salsa, and radishes. A spoonful of this soup brims with warmth and a robust flavor.
It's like my people.
Mexican food just may have been my favorite if it didn't have to compete with Italian.
Mind you, the Italians don't have tequila, and it was the determining factor in our decision to accept Juan's offer to stay the night.
The bonfire was lit and the music began with a mariachi band of Juan's friends playing their folk music for us.
The Jacks didn't have any equipment with them, but being circus performers, they didn't need any.
They entertained the party with their acrobatics and magic, performing several amazing feats under Darla's art of misdirection. Magda and Krista were able to contribute to the party with their music, but that left the rest of looking like no-talent bums, so we vowed to learn something that we could do to entertain an audience like this before the trip was over. I smelled a talent night coming and said to Dick and Cheesy, Ridgway style, and they both responded hell yeah. So we had to explain to Sandy and Rick that the stakes had just been raised. At the bonfire that night, Sandy got to sit back and hear the creation story of another culture.
Juan and his wife Maria took turns telling us about the Cocopa mythological figures like Sipa, the Cocopa creator god.
The Kakopa and other Sonoran tribes didn't consider their creator to be a benevolent spirit or a friend to humankind, rather a capricious and deceitful entity. He was eventually slain by his own creations after introducing death to the world. 1 began, in the beginning all the earth was covered with water, which meant Sipa and Komat, the creator gods, were under water and in the ground, living the way a child lives in its mother. They began talking about coming out, so Komat smoked a cigarette to get extra strength, and, because he was the older, he pushed Sipa out ahead of him.
Tough start in this neighborhood, Shizi whispered.
When they reached the outside, Komat became the younger and Sipa the older, because Sipa came out first. Shizi asked Marion, "Is that what Marius did to you, Marion?" And they all laughed, but no one really knew which of the two Seltrata twins was the seventh son of a seventh son. These two creator gods were twins, or as they are called in the language, Hawak. On their way up through the water, Komat asked his brother how he did it, and Sipa replied that he opened his eyes. When the older brother opened his eyes in the water, he was blinded. There was no ground, so they had the ants. Flying ants, little red ants, and big red ants all dig out hills of earth to make the ocean go down and to supply the land. Once the ground became dry in spots, Sipa and Komat started making men. Juan paused for the expect comment of, "What about the women?" but it didn't come.
Sipa and Komat made all kinds of human men in the form of Indians, Mexicans, Chinese, Americans, and so on. Komat, the blind twin, had to urinate, so he got up and walked into the bushes. While he was gone, Sipa changed the people he had made for the ones Komat had made, because they were better. When Komat returned, he felt of the men and knew he had not made them, because they were deformed and badly made. He said nothing and went ahead making more. Weak eyes, weak bladder, he had to go to the bushes to urinate again, and while he was gone Sipa changed his fox, a cross fox, for Komat's kit fox. When Komat came back, he knew that the animals had been changed, because he could hear his fox beating his tail against the ground. He could also tell the difference in the fur of the animal he had. Komat then called his fox by name. When his fox heard this, he scratched and tried to get away. Komat kept on working on his men all this time. After they had made all of the men they were going to make, they decided that they were ready for eyes. Sipa suggested that they be put in each of the 10 toes. Komat said that would not do because they would get hurt, and the men would be unable to see when they walked in water or in mud or dust. The best place for eyes was in the head, Komat said, and Sipa finally agreed, so now all men have 2 eyes in their heads, well above the ground, and if one gets hurt the other can be used. Sipa made a bow and arrow, and when this was finished, he shot the arrow into the air and it came down and hit Komat. Cheesy whispered, "Tough neighborhood." Komat asked him why he shot the arrow that way, and he explained to him that he should only use the bow and arrow to kill animals. Komat was sitting down at the time and the arrow came from behind and hit him in the back. The wound was not serious. Everything was dark, so Sipa attempted to make a sun. He made a very small one, and the light was no better than the moon. Komat didn't like that, so he started making a sun by easy stages. When he finished, he threw the sun into the east and it traveled east to west so that the people could know when to get up, when to work, and when to go to sleep. Sipa was going to throw his sun away, but Komat said, "No, let it stay, it will be the moon. The people can then tell the seasons, the months, and the days by the moon." Why is Komat so nice when Sipa is a royal dick? Krista asked rhetorically. When these things were finished, Sipa again changed his people for the ones made by Komat. When Komat discovered this substitution, he was very mad this time. He reached up and broke the skies and then went down into the earth, leaving a hole.
Sipa reached up and held the skies and jumped over the hole with his feet because smoke, air, electricity, and other things that cause death were coming up. Some of this escaped onto the earth through Sipa's toes, which caused sicknesses to be introduced. After the sky was fixed and the ground covered, Sipa sat down and made some more people and a house for them to live in. The house was turned to striped stone. It is on a mountain about 30 miles east of Tucson. The Maricopa know where this place is. I notice Rick writing this information in his book. I'm not sure if it was intended for Lance, Richard, or just general knowledge that he was interested in. Maybe he was getting the treasure hunting bug. Maria told us, Coyote is the trickster figure of Cocopa legends. He is clever but reckless and is constantly getting himself and the people around him into trouble with his irresponsible and socially inappropriate behavior. In some Cocopa stories, Coyote is generally a likable character who is merely greedy and impulsive.
In others, he commits serious crimes such as cannibalism and the abuse of women.
Coyote stories can be humorous in nature, but they can also be cautionary tales about the consequences of bad behavior and the dangers of interacting with reckless and immoral people. We had a final tequila salute before everyone found their way to where we slept that night. It was a very large, tented area with cots like an army tent, but a very satisfying breeze was blowing in from somewhere that carried a warm scent reminiscent of herbal tea as it relaxed me into a deep sleep. In the morning, after a quick repast, we gave our thanks to our host and piled everything back into the vehicles to head north across the border to the Salton Sea. Once on the American side, we followed Highway 111 through the Imperial Valley. Not very much had changed since we were last here, but that's probably the best thing when it comes to farmland. We passed the original Jack in the Box location where we had our first burger and then the Walmart where we purchased our fleet of two-wheeled vehicles. Brawley seemed to be on the upswing, as did Calipatria, but we were shocked when we finally cleared through the valley and hit the Salton Sink.
Highway 111 was lined with 50-style motels and fast food drive-ins.
Every chain had at least one if not two locations on each side of the strip, and each was accompanied by a motel styled after the same period with a two-story design centered around a swimming pool and backed by a parking lot. I was told that currently 50% of the units were occupied by the Celtradat construction crew and Uncle Sandu's people who were keeping them building every kind of structure imaginable. Tourists were starting to come in now that the place was getting a facelift and water was clearly on its way. Our group had an entire motel complex to ourselves with a 24/7 Jack in the Box attached. It was called the Seabreeze and we checked in at the front desk in the lobby of the motel. Marius informed us, this is designed after Route 66 in California from about 75 years ago with the motels, neon signs, and busy highway access. That was the last time this place was a hotspot. Many had large fire pits where people would gather at night and tell stories with the other travelers and watch the desert night sky, where they had big fountains where people would gather in the day out of the desert sun under some shade umbrellas.
Marion added.
We found our rooms and got settled in with what we had brought with us, but Errol and I were off to the local Walmart as soon as we were hooked up with transportation. A rack of bicycles by the pool appeared our best bet. Marius told us take whichever ones you want or get some keys from the front desk. I think there's a car or two assigned here. Normally they take the workers to the job sites so they aren't exactly pristine, but they can take you to Walmart and back. Walmart had everything Errol and I wanted, and we were feeling pretty good decked out in new outfits complete with hats. In fact, we each bought 6 different hats, because every time we saw a new hat we could think of a time when we would need one just like that. Hats were cheap and we could always share them around or leave them behind.
We returned to our room and were putting away our new purchases when I heard a knock on the door below our room and went out on the balcony to investigate. It was Richard, and he had traveled from India to pick up the documents that Rick had purchased for him. Richard was accompanied by Henri Seltradet, who was waiting in the car while he picked up the documents. Rick answered his door and acknowledged Richard. "Oh wow, that was fast. You must really want these documents badly." And Richard replied, "Henri and I were coming for a trip anyway to stay with Lance for a couple weeks, so I thought we may as well do it sooner than later. I have a doctor friend who is in San Diego at the moment as well that I want to see with these documents. Lance has those 2 cabins he built on his property to rent out. Is that where you're staying?" And Richard replied that it was, and commented on their rustic nature. "If you get desperate, I'm sure they'll put you up here. Just ask Uncle Sandu." So that's how Richard knew about Father Kino. Lance must have documents he found in the cave before Marius went in and found the hidden documents. But how does Richard know Lance, and why would he give him the documents? After Richard left, I went down and asked Rick if he wanted to go for a Jack-in-the-Box lunch feast. Many of our crew were already there finishing up their lunch and making plans for the afternoon. I asked Rick, "Was that Richard the first saw leaving a few minutes ago?" And he said, "Yeah, he's staying with Lance up in the canyon for a while. He must have really wanted those documents to get here that fast." I didn't know Richard knew Lance. I said, and he told me that Lance came to visit him in India when he left the army. Richard happened to be there as well, and Lance and Richard talked a lot about archaeology. Lance is very knowledgeable about the history of this part of the world. He probably would have gone into that field if he hadn't gone to West Point. Now he's got his investments here, so he's set and fancies himself an Indiana Jones. This made me extremely curious as to what Richard could possibly be looking for, so I thought I would hunt down Marius and learn more about this situation as well as let him know what I had just found out. Marius was packing up a couple of bikes for him and Marion to ride up to the property he purchased next to Lance's place and do a little rock climbing. Although I was not an avid rock climber, I decided to join them just to learn more about the hunt. I only had a couple hours because I was joining Cheesy and Sandy later at the site for their new underwater fantasy park development. On the ride up to the site, Marius told us, "I figured the cliff wall is public domain as long as you don't get to it by passing over someone's private property." I climbed up to the cave from my property one day, but when I entered the cave, I saw it was bare to the walls. Perhaps there was something there at one time, but Lance got to it first. This made me extremely curious as to what Richard could possibly be looking for, so I thought I would hunt down Marius and learn more about this situation as well as let him know what I had just found out. Marius was packing up a couple of bikes for him and Marion to ride up to the property he purchased next to Lance's place and do a little rock climbing. As I sat there contemplating what to do next, I noticed a small crack under the rock I was leaning against, and I could feel a very slight breeze coming through the crack. I had a tool in my knapsack that I thought would let me prod around underneath the rock. I was able to slide a small caliper underneath and eventually snagged a piece of paper that I managed to drag back through. "What was on it?" I asked. The page was a map without a beginning or an end, so simply a mystery. There were more pages behind the rock, but I think I pushed them out of range. Perhaps they were torn pages, but this one looks complete. I'll show you the map when we get to my camp. I was told Pasos por la Tierra a la California was a Kino map from more than 300 years ago, which was the first map to show Baja connected to the continent. Father Kino maps give considerable accuracy in locating a great number of villages, missions, pueblos, rivers, and mountains of Sonora and of what is now known as Arizona and Old California. All this I found out after learning of Richard's interest in Father Kino.
Marius informed me, for every one of his published maps, they say he made 100 private maps of things of much more interest.
My page of a map may fit into a much larger map that will guide me to a starting point.
After all, he would have had to travel to the location on my map while mapping the general area and other features.
Well, that's a revelation. You didn't tell me the map you found was a Kino map. I said.
Our trip to Marius Camp was about 5 kilometers from the motel we started out from. Our path began on Frink Road, which was barely a path through the desert scrub.
Lizards and snakes scattered as we rode through to interrupt their basking in the afternoon sun.
Eventually we hooked up with Coachella Canal Road and crossed the canal at Siphon 18. Gasline Road ran down the other side of the canal until we hit another dirt path, climbing the slope towards the canyon's end. We arrived at Marius Canyon property, and one of the RVs we used on our last trip to the Salton Sea was parked near the road's entrance. Marion took the bikes and hung them on a rack at the back of the RV while Marius went inside and came back out with a tube in his hand. He shook it out on a table under a tarpaulin and the map page slid out of the tube and onto the table. I think he has a very identifiable style, Marius. Marion observed, if we find the big map that this is a piece of, we may be just one step away from the target.
Possibly.
Marius agreed but added, or maybe there are several steps and they could be anywhere in California or Arizona. The rock looks like it was pushed forward into the slot from behind rather than from in the cave.
That could indicate there is a lot more room behind there than we think. And what does Lance have, if anything? And what's left in the cave behind that rock? And why was there a breeze? And why do you have so many questions and no answers? Marion asked.
I decided to leave them to their rock climbing and exploring the cliffs for more caves or artifacts and rode back down to the water's edge to see the new fantasy diving park being built. Cheesy and Sandy had been there since sunrise and I was supposed to be meeting them for a tour. Frink Road crossed Highway 111 right at the Nyland Marina Road, which was perfect because I was to meet them at the end of the road at the top of the berm.
As I approached, I could see the berm rising up in front of me. Cheesy was on top and could see me approach from more than a kilometer away. I reached the bottom and dragged the bike up 20 feet to the top of the berm, which opened up to a 10-meter walkway before dropping down on the other side more than 20 meters to what will eventually be the sea floor. That was where the building was going on for the fantasy diving park. When the new Salton Sea reached its projected maximum level, the reef should be about 10 meters below the surface. Sandy let me know, we have a lease on 4 square kilometers of sea bottom to build a fantasy diving park that will create multiple artificial reefs, support coral in this environment and attract a wide variety of sea life. Later we're going to have a conference call with Dr. Sue about the coral she's picked out for us. We have a small workshop on the other side of the berm where we'll grow the stock and prepare for the water arriving. He pointed to a group of structures being built in the corner section next to the berm. There will be 4 distinct areas for people to dive or snorkel, beginning with Atlantis. As you know, Atlantis was a fictional island mentioned in Plato's work Timaeus and Critias, where he documented structures, roadways, and buildings. We're building his vision in this area in concrete over wire mesh, with more than 50 buildings in the complex. Cheesy added, 50 buildings that look like they've been underwater for 3,000 years. Then Cheesy motioned to an area beyond Atlantis, but along the southern berm. Famous Shipwrecks is going to be my favorite. The Black Swan, the Queen Anne's Revenge, the Mary Rose, and for the Americans, a replica of the Titanic. Sandy wanted Varka to go with Atlantis, but Carl said the Americans wouldn't recognize it. What's going in over there?
I said and pointed out to the other side of the shipwrecks, to which Sandy replied, "Dive with the dinosaurs."
More than 40 dinosaurs from all three Mesozoic periods.
Different sizes, groups, herds, pods, and packs, in action poses, and even with some shock effect lighting for night diving. And we had a good laugh as he posed like each of the dinosaurs in the photo ops. And finally, to go with the theme of the new Celtrodad Hotel, the last area is going to be an Aztec city with a plaza and temples. Easy to build with concrete and wire mesh. We've even got some stelas written in Mayan text with coded messages that people need to decipher as part of a greater puzzle that can be changed daily if we want.
He added.
What's a stela?
I asked and Cheesy said, it's like a signpost that people can read if they understand the Maya text.
I love the way the dates are expressed in a sort of historical perspective.
Very neat concept for this area.
And it ties in with the other stuff like scavenger hunts and relays.
We left the berm and climbed down the other side.
There were designated places for people to disembark from the berm, but it was easy enough to hop the rail and climb down the side to the road that ran alongside it. About a block and a half away was a small building Sandy was using as a marine laboratory for their corals. We knocked on the door before entering. Inside was a young lady attending to one of the tanks and adding spoons of a white powder from a large container.
I'll be with you in a minute, Sandy.
When she finished what she was doing, she removed her gloves and washed her hands before she offered one of them to us. Sandy introduced her as Stephanie Murdoch, a PhD student from Melbourne, and she took over from there. Corals live together with plants, in a close symbiotic relationship.
Algae symbionts can perform photosynthesis, a process to transform sunlight into energy.
In our coral symbiosis, the energy coming from all algae symbionts becomes food for the corals. The algae also provide the colors you see when you look at reefs. Corals are colorless. If something happens to the algae inside, the coral becomes bleached or transparent because the algae no longer provide the color. High temperature or other adverse conditions, including very high salinity, can do it as well. Red Sea corals are more resistant to bleaching in summer temperatures reaching 35 degrees Celsius, while ocean waters may typically be 5 degrees cooler. The ability to live in high salinity water is one of the secrets of the strong Red Sea corals. Aptasia is a tiny anemone that shares a similar body structure with corals but lacks the skeleton.
It has the same symbiosis with algae and are closely related.
They are easily kept in the laboratory, whereas corals need a lot of care.
They need big aquarium tanks with lots of technology to keep them alive, which makes corals hard to study. We have a combination here. She pointed to several different tanks and indicating what they were. It seems there is a difference in the amount of bleaching between the different salinities. Corals and anemones have the same salinity inside their cells as the seawater and break down molecules called osmolytes. This molecule adjusts salinity it produces to reduce the salt difference between the inside of a cell and the outside. No difference in salinity means no water movement. Similar to a bull shark, which can adjust for salinity and swim into freshwater rivers.
She moved us over to another large tank to show us some coral specimens.
This is a cropra, the most common type of coral in the Red Sea.
Green or brown color, growing either in plates or branches. It grows quickly, and the biggest threat to it is bleaching. Gorgonia coral is more commonly known as a Venus fan or common sea fan.
It can reach 1.5 meters in height.
The skeleton is made of calcite and flattened branches run along the flat part of the fan to hold its shape.
I like this one as habitat.
Fungia varies in color from white to pink, blue, purple, or yellow and is generally round or oval in shape to resemble a fan mushroom.
See the mouth in the center of the circle? Tentacles sprout. We thanked her for such an informative tour and left to return to our motel for the evening festivities. I had to ride my bike back, but it was only a couple of kilometers. When I got back to the motel, Uncle Sandu was sitting by the pool with the Celtradettes and he motioned me over to tell me, "We are talking about my sister Alexandria. She's running to become the president of Transnistria under her maiden name of Celtradat. Alexandria Celtradat for president. Can you believe it? She's equipped. Is that a province of Narnia?"
Uncle Sandu continued, "It's officially called the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic and is a breakaway state from the old Soviet Union. The territory lies between the river Dniester and the Moldovan and Ukrainian borders and is internationally recognized as part of Moldavia. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was established in hopes it would remain within the Soviet Union.
Citizens were deeply concerned that Moldavia would seek unification with Romania.
To them, that was not an option. Transnistria is an independent presidential republic with its own government, parliament, military, police, postal system, currency, and vehicle registration. Its authorities have adopted a constitution, flag, national anthem, and coat of arms.
They are actually one of 4 countries in this type of situation along with Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Artsakh. Relations are friendly with each other in the form of the Community for Democracy and Rights of Nations. What do you think her chances are, Sandu? Sandy asked.
It seems like her chances are extremely good. Carl is involved in her campaign and believes she is the front-running candidate in a country that has merely 500,000 voters. More than half of those are pensioners who are living on a mere fraction of what they need to survive. Guaranteed pensions with increases are a platform that can't fail. Hell, she may get 100% of the vote. Carl's involved? Why is Carl involved? I asked. Uncle Sandu replied, Carl is looking to the future. He believes we will have the need to refile many patents from around the world in the future to establish the rights of the Tesla family network and the Pendulum Group's future interests. The security of those patents has been in question over the years, with many of them being removed or adjusted after the fact in various countries. Carl wants to ensure there is no question of ownership in the future going forward. The independence of the Transnistria patent system in conjunction with the Canadian will ensure they are tamper-proof. But of course, money is key to all of this. Transnistria will be the center of Carl's banking requirements. That's not the only news. General Antipov is going to run for the Secretary-General position of the United Nations. Marius spit out the drink he had just put to his mouth and Marion started coughing. They couldn't believe their ears. Holy shit! This is unbelievable, Marion said, and Marius just shook his head in disbelief. Ian believes the Pendulum Group will need the support of the UN bigwigs to manage world issues when world-changing news events are eventually released. General Antipov is the perfect candidate from Pendulum's perspective. The UN General Assembly is the main policy-making arm of member states and provides a unique forum for multilateral discussion of a full spectrum of international issues under the Charter. Each of the 193 members has an equal vote. Ian says to be selected as the Secretary-General, a candidate must receive the votes of at least 9 members of the United Nations Security Council, including no vetoes from permanent members. Who are the permanent members? Darla asked.
Permanent members include China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States. Ian feels he can ensure the United Kingdom votes favorability. Carl has spoken to Dick's grandfather to secure his support. The Soviets will not object, and China and France still having their balls in the air. Who else can we get votes from to make up the 9? Magda asked.
The other members include Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, India, Ireland, Kenya, Mexico, Norway, and the United Arab Emirates. Ian believes he can secure a positive vote from Kenya and is currently investigating some additional options. I said, I may have connections for Brazil and Mexico that I can encourage.
Let me speak with Ian and I will get back to you, Uncle Sandu. I was thinking about Juan Pedro and his brother Rafael.
This would align our interests with Juan Pedro's as he had suggested. Adjusted after the fact in various countries. Carl wants to ensure there is no question of ownership in the future going forward. The independence of the Transnistria patent system in conjunction with the Canadian will ensure they are tamper-proof. The Secretary General is then appointed by the formality of a majority vote in the United Nations General Assembly. Uncle Sandu finished. We left our little impromptu meeting amazed at how things were moving along on a world front. Marius, Marion, and I sat down after the meeting to have a beer. Now that Florin has the book and the mask, he has the ability to create additional animals that can move through this realm into whatever realm they move to.
Marius stated.
Marion added, once Florin perfects the execution of the recipe and template interpretation, we can combine that with a breakthrough on Sir Malcolm's ability to live within an animal. Imagine, we're this close to moving a person's mind into an animal and then through to another realm.
Can you believe that?
Yes, I can. I thought to myself. Vital force is visible everywhere. The Atman of the deceased looking for their reincarnation. All of them, big and small, staying and going. Sandy and I were sitting with Rick when he received a call from Dr. Ben, which we all linked in on.
Brown recluse venom, like many of the other brown spider venoms, is cytotoxic and hemolytic. It contains at least 8 components, including enzymes such as hyaluronidase, deoxyribonuclease, ribonuclease, alkaline phosphatase, and lipase.
Dr. Ben told us.
Rick asked him, did the interpretation of the scroll by Richard tell you what part of the spider venom we need for the formula?
Dr. Ben replied, not quite, but I'm getting closer, I think.
Venoms are a complex cocktail of compounds, like salts, small organic molecules, peptides, and proteins.
Peptides are the primary component of spider venoms, and some species produce venom containing more than 1,000 unique peptides of significant mass.
We are analyzing this one now.
Spider venoms in general are conservatively predicted to contain more than 10 million bioactive peptides.
Then there are the latrid toxins, which induce neurotransmitter release.
I think that's where the secret of our 8-legged bugger lies.
How so?
I asked. Latrid toxins play an important role in dissecting the process of synaptic vesicle exocytosis. Dr. Ben stated, and we all just looked at each other and shrugged. Sorry, he said. Let me see. Synaptic vesicle exocytosis is the biological process by which a synaptic vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane of the presynaptic axon terminal and releases its contents into the synaptic cleft.
Now hold on, let me continue. Chemical synapses allow neurons to form circuits within the central nervous system. They're crucial to the biological computations that underlie perception and thought. They allow the nervous system to connect to and control other systems of the body. At a chemical synapse,
one neuron releases neurotransmitter molecules into a small space called the synaptic cleft adjacent to another neuron.
The neurotransmitters are contained within synaptic vesicles and are released into the synaptic cleft by a process called exocytosis. See, simple. These molecules bind to neurotransmitter receptors on the postsynaptic cell.
Think about this in the context of a psilocybin trip connected to a separate organism through the mycelium network. And he folded his hands on his chest as if he was quite proud of himself. Neuroconnections are made within Lord Andrew or Sir Malcolm to recognize new feelings from their connections to the tigers during their experiences. And I would think vice versa, in that the tiger senses a request for that type of information. Dr. Ben was busy patting himself on the back while we digested what he had just spoon-fed us. Later that day, while having dinner with Cheesy at the Jack in the Box, he received a call from Jeffrey. That made me think things were buzzing everywhere in the world today.
The website was buzzing, that was for sure. Apparently, they had their first attempted poaching of a rhinoceros overnight and were able to prevent it. With 27 rhinos on the property now, they were a huge target for the poachers who continued to chase raising bounties on the horn of any species of rhino. Cheesy said, according to my friend Lorenzo, a Chinese businesswoman known as Beatrice Chan increased the bounty on rhino horn to more than $500,000 American dollars. My dad says Sumatran officials are very worried that their species will go extinct if anti-poaching efforts fail.
Jeffrey told him. We stopped this attempt, but we lost one rhino in the effort. My dad says something is not right about this attempt, and he has seen many over the years. They had no means of removing the horn or transporting the animal. Either they were waiting for accomplices or had some alternative plan that he doesn't understand. Perhaps a plane or helicopter was going to land, but there was no evidence of that. Cheesy commended him on his work and asked him to convey the same message to his dad and Hamish. Since there were still very few people around the area, especially in the summer, we decided to have our bonfire on top of the berm overlooking the future sea.
Sandy and Marius found us a good spot near the fantasy diving park.
At near sundown we headed to the berm in a parade of decorated vehicles carrying all of our party supplies.
I felt like I was having a Burning Man moment.
When we discussed the rhino bounty later that evening on our way to the bonfire, Magda told us, in China, bees symbolize ambition and success as the result of hard work. Bee colonies are symbolic of imperial courts, and the sting of the bee is representative of the discipline required to maintain order.
Beatrice may not be the name her parents gave her.
Sandy told us, bee symbolism and mythology is particularly vibrant in Hindu culture as well. Remember how Brigu told the Brahmins they had to earn success through hard work?
In other Hindu mythology, a demon called Aranasura terrorized heaven and earth.
The gods called on Parvati to do something, so she transformed into the goddess Brahmari, goddess of bees and hornets. With her stingers, she was able to destroy the demon. Honey is a sacred nectar believed to bring health, happiness, and prosperity.
It's a symbol for gods Vishnu, Krishna, and Indra, who collectively are referred to as the Madhava. Krishna is sometimes depicted with a blue bee on his forehead. Scientists have discovered that bees actually sense electric fields that emanate from flowers.
Big Wham was investigating that. In what seems like a miracle of nature, through electric fields, bees can sense types of flowers as well as whether they are full of nectar or empty.
Some bees, like the rare blue calamintha bee, focus only on select flowers.
Sandy told us, the San people of the Kalahari Desert, in Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, have a creation legend about bees. In the story, a praying mantis wanted to cross a rough river that had heavy currents. He wished to go home to his family. Taking pity on him, a generous bee offered to carry him across the river. The journey was so arduous that a day and night passed and they still had not crossed. The bee became so tired, she didn't think she could make it across the river. When she saw a flower floating in the river, she landed on it. Fortunately, the flower floated to the other riverbank. The mantis was relieved to reach dry land, but he looked at the bee. He realized she had died from exhaustion. Saddened, he waited for the sun to rise to figure out what to do. When the sun came up, he looked to the bee who was gone and a tiny human being had taken her place. This is how the first human was born, from the generosity and sacrifice of the bee. The sweeter the honey, the stronger the queen? I wondered. Sandy gave us some statistics about the Sunny Bono Walkway berm. The maximum depth of the surface is currently 25 meters below sea level. The area around the shoreline was about 20 meters below sea level. To that they added a 9-meter berm reinforced on both sides by steel walls and filled in between with earth from the seabed. That should allow the level of water to increase by 10 meters. Marius added, "Don't forget the electric train that's going to run around the entire berm." Sandy told us Ian learned that Prince Melon Tusk, the new owner of the electric vehicle manufacturer Tesla, was a huge fan of the one-eyed jacks. In fact, Prince Melon flew to the US to see one of their first performances in Vegas. Marius added, Ian introduced Prince Melon to us and we scheduled him on a talk show we were appearing on. He had a blast and he's actually a really nice fellow with some interesting plans for his country and his father's billions. Or are they trillions, Marius? The prince was thrilled about his new friendship with the jacks. In fact, he came to stay at the Salton Sea for a fortnight and then decided to purchase a piece of land for himself. Uncle Sandu is building his home as one of his priority projects. Prince Melon loved the Salton Sea so much that he donated for electric engines to pull a small-gauge tourist train around the entire berm. Uncle Sandu informed us of the overall plan. The concept for the Sunny Bono Railway includes over 100 kilometers of rail to be built and each kilometer will be sponsored by different corporate sponsors who can erect a sign at the start of their rail section. Additional sponsors will be able to purchase a passenger car to go with one of the 4 engines. Each car can be painted by the corporate sponsor but with tasteful environmental concepts requiring approval and no corporate logos. Marius and Marion brought in all kinds of corporate sponsors for individual cars to be added to the train, including several donated by the Jack in the Box Corporation. The Jacks even arranged for Prince Melon to have a cameo in one of the JIB commercials. That in turn got him an appearance on The Poison Tongue. Sandy informed us that Carl was coming to the Salton Sea for some meetings that were being held regarding the overall project and the 105th Congress specifications. Their goals of salinity, fish and wildlife and recreational use are all good, but there are a couple of others that Dick's grandfather and Carl are trying to modify. What are those about? I asked and he said, surface level over sea level and irrigation drainage. The Cell Trotette ladies had their own pet project which was coming up before we leave. They've created the first annual Sunny Bono Art Challenge. Each artist was to be assigned a board mounted against the berm to paint on. The space allowed for their canvas was an area equal to 8 feet wide by 8 feet high. Since this was the United States, they used imperial measurements. The festival topic for the first year was the Cosmic Sea, and entrance would be judged by a group of celebrities and art critics from across California. First prize in each of 3 categories was $100,000 US, and the winning entries would be installed in a permanent location on the Sunny Bono Walkway. Darla told me that more than 400 artists from around the world had secured a square for the first year's event. Only the winners would remain permanently, and each year new winners would be added. All other artworks became the property of the artist, who could remove them, recycle them, or sell them. Uncle Sandu was setting up hundreds of campsites in areas that they hadn't developed yet. Tourists' traffic up and down the berm for the 3-day festival was going to swell the population of the area exponentially. JIB was going to be flipping burgers all day. The next day we decided to circumnavigate the sea by the same path we took the first time we were here, to see if things were developing the way we had anticipated they would. We started out at the corner of Isles of Palms and 5th Street, the prime property of Bombay Beach and the future home of the Cel Trotet Hotel and Circus Complex. According to Marius, the theme was going to be Aztec, with a replica of the Pyramid of the Sun, multiple terraces for patrons to enjoy the view of the sea, under the stars, in the night air, and party like the world is ending tomorrow, as he exclaimed. We began our drive along the eastern shore of the Salton Sea via Grapefruit Boulevard and saw vast empty spaces on our left all the way down to the berm. Initially, we had thought a housing development or even a golf course would go here, but there were no plans for this area yet that anyone could determine. It was still early days and prices were continuing to rise quickly. The Salt Creek area was made safe and raised above the berm level where necessary to preserve the habitat for wildlife that depended on this wetland. The North Shore Airport space was gone, and we passed by the reservation lands until we turned south along the western shore on Highway 86 to see what had been done to preserve the Desert Shores area, which we thought was very low and not a good investment at the time. Sure enough, Desert Shores was cut in half by the new berm, which could not preserve any more of that area and still raise the level of the sea to where they wanted it to be. Holt Avenue, California Avenue, and Eddy Avenue were still viable, but the others were a thing of the past. We passed the Red Earth Casino, which didn't seem to be doing much more business than they were the last time we passed, so we proceeded on to Salton City. Signs of new construction and people beginning to occupy the area were obvious everywhere. The city had already been laid out with streets, sewers, and lights the last time we were here, but they were not functioning at that point. Up one street, down the next, we traveled through the city for a half an hour and were amazed at the number of sites that showed signs of habitation. From Salton City we headed south again to where the Imperial Valley was beginning to encroach on the sink. This was the location of the new canal, which was going to fill the Salton Sea. It was only flowing at a trickle now, but Sandy quoted some large numbers that all pointed towards a date 18 months in the future. Dick told us Dad and Grandfather bought some canyon property off the west side. Grandfather has an entire canyon right up to the cliff wall with only one way in. He's even built into the cliff to protect himself from enemies above. Always the military strategist. And perhaps why he has enemies in the first place. Is he getting ready for an apocalypse? I asked. You sound like you've seen it. It's in a canyon off Movid Mountain on the west side near Brawley Avenue. There are a number of private roadways leading into the canyon area on that side. They've already built structures and have a crew working up there now. I was there for a week before you guys got here. Sandy added, another project group is trying to promote the building of the tallest fountain in the world. Prevailing winds are over the western mountains and up the Imperial Valley across the lake toward Palm Desert and Palm Springs. Increased humidity decreases the effect of heat, and something huge could have a significant impact. The biggest fountain in the world currently is King Fahd's Fountain in Jeddah, which jets water 260 meters above the Red Sea. It would be fitting that we compete with the Red Sea. The World Cup fountain in Seoul is the only other one over 200 meters. Some of the smaller fountains are more about their entertainment value with light shows and recorded music. The prefect spot would be halfway between the east side and the west side, Marius noted. I was beginning to think that everyone was forgetting the Salton Sink and surrounding basin was sitting over the San Andreas Fault, San Jacinto Fault, and the Imperial Fault Zone. Geologists determined previous flooding episodes from the Colorado River were linked to earthquakes along the San Andreas Fault.
Sonar was used to map the Salton Sea's underwater faults.
Earthquakes higher than magnitude 7 seem to occur every 180 years, but the last one occurred more than 300 years ago.
Perhaps we should have felt overdue.
Later that night before the evening bonfire, we had a conference call with Ian, Florin, and Dr. Ross regarding progress they were making on various Tesla initiatives. Dr. Ross began, one of Tesla's theories was to use the Earth itself as the medium for conducting currents, which would not require wires or any other artificial conductors. A pump would draw electricity from the Earth and drive it back into the same at an enormous rate, thus creating ripples or disturbances which, spreading through the Earth as through a wire, could be detected at great distances by carefully attuned receiving circuits. The mathematics of which he explains, in theory. Florin read from one of Tesla's diary entries, "I was able to transmit considerable amounts of energy, and I am convinced that I shall ultimately succeed in conveying power without wires, for industrial purposes, with high economy, and to any distance, however great." We know Tesla demonstrated wireless power transmission at Colorado Springs by lighting electric lights mounted outside the building where he had his large experimental coil.
Was that the first Earth resonance? The Schumann resonances are a set of spectrum peaks in the extremely low-frequency portion of the Earth's electromagnetic field spectrum. Schumann resonances are global electromagnetic resonances, generated and excited by lightning discharges in the cavity formed by the Earth's surface and the ionosphere.
Global electromagnetic resonances occur because the space between the surface of the Earth and the conductive ionosphere acts as a closed waveguide. Immediately I thought, Cheesy knew that. Waveguides. The limited dimensions of the Earth cause this waveguide to act as a resonant cavity for electromagnetic waves in the ELF band. The cavity is naturally excited by the electric currents in lightning. Schumann resonances are the principal background in the part of the electromagnetic spectrum from 3 Hz through 60 Hz and appear as distinct peaks at extremely low frequencies around 7.83 Hz or fundamental, 14.3, 20.8, 27.3 and 33.8 Hz.
Those numbers were starting to twig memories of Magda and her whales. Those ranges sounded familiar. The fundamental mode is a standing wave in the Earth ionosphere cavity with a wavelength equal to the circumference of the Earth. The lowest frequency mode has the highest intensity, and the frequency of all modes can vary slightly owing to solar-induced perturbations to the ionosphere. They compress the upper wall of the closed cavity. The higher resonance modes are spaced at approximately 6.5 Hz intervals, a characteristic attributed to the atmosphere's spherical geometry. I must keep in mind that all of these are mathematical adjustments once detected. It's a two-part process. The peaks exhibit a spectral width of approximately 20% on account of the damping of the respective modes in the dissipative cavity. More recently, discrete Schumann resonance excitations have been linked to transient luminous events. What is a transient luminous event, Florin? Ian asked. Upper atmospheric lightning or ionospheric lightning are terms to refer to a family of short-lived electrical breakdown phenomena that occur very high up.
They call it luminous plasma. The various types of electrical discharge phenomena in the upper atmosphere lack several characteristics of the more familiar tropospheric lightning.
Sprites are large-scale electrical discharges that occur high above a thunderstorm cloud. They can be colored reddish-orange or greenish-blue and have hanging tendrils below and arcing branches above. Spectacular. Jets and elves are also effects of this type lighting up the upper atmosphere. The fact the ionosphere is capable of trapping electromagnetic waves is what is going to prove to be central to this process. Consider important mathematical tools for dealing with spherical waveguides and the theoretical aspects of the global resonances of the Earth ionosphere waveguide system if you can. Lightning discharges are considered to be the primary natural source of Schumann resonance excitation. Lightning channels behave like huge antennas that radiate electromagnetic energy at frequencies below about 100 kHz. Those signals are very weak at large distances from the lightning source, but the Earth ionosphere waveguide behaves like a resonator at ELF frequencies and amplifies the spectral signals from lightning at the resonance frequencies. In an ideal cavity, the resonant frequency of the NTH mode is determined by the Earth radius and the speed of light. The real Earth ionosphere waveguide is not a perfect electromagnetic resonant cavity. We will adjust. Losses due to finite ionosphere electrical conductivity lower the propagation speed of electromagnetic signals in the cavity, resulting in a resonance frequency that is lower than would be expected in an ideal case, and the observed peaks are wide. In addition, there are a number of horizontal asymmetries, day-night difference in the height of the ionosphere, latitudinal changes in the Earth's magnetic field, sudden ionospheric disturbances, polar cap absorption, variation in the Earth radius of plus or minus 11 kilometers from equator to geographic poles, etc. that produce other effects in the Schumann resonance power spectra. Today's Schumann resonances are recorded at many separate research stations around the world. The sensors used to measure Schumann resonances typically consist of two horizontal magnetic inductive coils for measuring the north-south and east-west components of the magnetic field, and a vertical electric dipole antenna for measuring the vertical component of the electric field. The amplitude of the Schumann resonance magnetic field is approximately 1 picotesla, which is many orders of magnitude smaller than the Earth's magnetic field, which is approximately 30 to 50 microteslas. Specialized receivers and antennas are needed to detect and record Schumann resonances. Tesla is a unit of measure? I asked. Tesla is the unit of measurement required to define the magnetic flux density. A unit of measurement on the International System of Units or the metric system. 1 Tesla is the same as 1 Weber, which represents magnetic flux per square meter. With higher Tesla scanners, the magnet is stronger, both in general and within the bore of the machine. Dr. Ross told us. Florin continued, the electric component is commonly measured with a ball antenna, connected to a high-impedance amplifier. The magnetic induction coils typically consist of tens to hundreds of thousands of turns of wire wound around a core of very high magnetic permeability. At any given time, there are about 2,000 thunderstorms around the globe producing 50 lightning events per second directly linked to the background Schumann resonance signal. Determining the spatial lightning distribution from Schumann resonance records is a complex problem. In order to estimate the lightning intensity from Schumann resonance records, it is necessary to account for both the distance to lightning sources and the wave propagation between the source and the observer. The African peak is the strongest, reflecting the major contribution of the African chimney to global lightning activity. Schumann resonance amplitude records show significant diurnal and seasonal variations which in general coincide in time with the times of the day-night transition. Now you've been found out. A closed, planetary-sized, ellipsoidal cavity, consisting of a conducting lower and upper boundary set separated by an insulating medium. That's what's required, no others need apply. For the Earth, the conducting lower boundary is its surface, while the upper boundary is the ionosphere. A source of electrical excitation of electromagnetic waves in the ELF range. Earth resonance. Energy for all? Free?
Ian later told me that major advances in energy development and the Tesla inventions still required further work, but some patents required refiling on this topic. New patents also had to be filed on topics which Florin and Dr. Roz required Cheesy's help with. Cheesy was going to Moldavia to work with Dr. Roz and Florent for a few months, but I'm sure he hoped Darla would appear. He told me what he knew of the science that they would be working on, but it was physics, not computers, mathematics, or biology. If seismic waves arrive at vibration-detecting instruments like seismometers all at the same time, it would be difficult to tell them apart.
The fastest seismic waves are known as P waves, with the P standing for primary. These waves were the first to arrive at seismometers from some distant quake. P waves travel between 5 and 8 kilometers per second within the planet, where pressures are higher and material is typically denser. They can reach up to 13 kilometers per second if let loose and travel through rock, the same way that sound waves travel through air. Waveguides again, I thought. They move as pressure waves. When a pressure wave passes a certain point, the material it's passing through moves forward, then back, along the same path that the wave is traveling. P waves can travel through solids, liquids, and gases. That's one big difference between them and the other types of seismic waves, which typically travel only through solids like rock. Next fastest seismic wave is the secondary or S waves. And of course, they are the second set of waves to reach the seismometers from a distant quake. They're only 60% as fast as the P waves through material is moved from side to side or up and down compared to the direction the wave is traveling. Different than the P wave. These waves are known as transverse waves. The types of stresses set up by those waves can only be transmitted through solid materials. Sonic waves, vibrations, waveguides, and some type of rocks, I think. Cap ice? With breakfast over and the sun shining brightly around the pool, I spread my yoga mat out between Cheesy and Dick and prepared to meditate when I was suddenly distracted by a commotion near the lobby of the motel. A car had just pulled up and Uncle Sandu was calling for Sandy. Then I saw Carl getting out of the car and another younger fellow getting out of the other side.
Cheesy and Dick were both interrupted from their meditation, and when Cheesy saw who it was, he was up and running to the lobby. "Lorenzo," he was shouting, and the other fellow yelled Gordon, and then there was a lot of hugging and handshaking while Carl and Sandy were more subtle in their mutual greetings. As it turned out, Carl had hired Lorenzo to manage the new cell trot at ADW for their hotel and circus chain. Carl brought Lorenzo here for the weekend to meet the people he'd be working for. Personal bonds are always harder to break, he told me. At the bonfire that night, Cheesy and Lorenzo entertained us with stories of their antics in New York with the hacker community that Cheesy used to throw the parties for. It was Lorenzo's idea to add the Teacher Dick of the Month award that would be awarded to the teacher who pulled the biggest boner during the month. Mr. Freeman was one of my favorites, Lorenzo said, and Cheesy added, he deserved everything he got and more. Tell us what he did, Krista wanted to know. He was in charge of buying new computers for the computer lab, so he made a deal with the vendor to deliver one computer to his house for every 10 he delivered to the school. Then he sold the ones from home and pocketed the money. So, what did you do? Magda asked. Cheesy was having a hard time getting it out because he was laughing so much at the memory of the night. He was getting 5 computers delivered, so we arranged for him to also be delivered at exactly the same time. 12 pizzas, 6 buckets of chicken, 9 online scheduled grocery orders, 6 couriers for pickup, and so many more that it caused a huge bottleneck in the neighborhood that it made it on the late-night news. Lorenzo picked it up with, we charged everything prepaid to his credit cards. It took him months to sort it out, and he finally gave up and paid off the balances. I think Mr. Dingus was our best revenge because it was the outcome his crimes dictated, Cheesy said, and Lorenzo nodded, but there were no smiles. Tell us, Krista demanded. Mr. Dingus would pass anyone who wanted it enough, but may be denied by other means. It was usually the nice-looking girls in the class who could not quite make the grade for one reason or another that required one of his private tutoring sessions at his cabin in the Adirondacks. So how did you get even? Darla asked. Lorenzo cleared his throat and said, one weekend when he was enjoying the rustic beauty of his cabin, his home computer seemed to become a web server for a massive amount of porn. Monday morning, before he could get up for work, the porn squad broke down his door and hauled him off to jail in his underwear. I could see Cheesy wanting to smile, but he tried to hide it. I still say 7 years for what he didn't do is still generous for what he did do, Cheesy said, and Lorenzo had to agree with him. Krista applauded. The rest of us didn't know how to react. Lorenzo and Cheesy kept us laughing for another hour before Magda and Krista took over with a number of awesome ballads. Magda asked us to listen to a song they were practicing for Uncle Arthur and Uncle Artis. I knew immediately it was going to be a direct hit to their tough Aussie hearts. I left for the comfort of my bed while the party still had fuel, but I didn't. I had a satisfying breakfast at the Jack in the Box the next morning, where they were running the JIB commercials on several different monitors to the delight of the customers, including me. The Ridgeway-style entertainment challenge was beginning to wear on me, so I consulted with Cheesy as to what we could do. He came up with a plan for us, but it was going to take some practice, so I put myself in his capable hands and dragged my yoga mat out to our power session with Sandy. Rick and Dick were already set up and oblivious to my arrival. Sandy had positioned himself opposite to them, so it was obvious where I was destined to go. Cheesy sat up beside me, and additional people began to arrive. This was going to be a huge session, I thought as I tried to prepare my focus, but I wasn't quite there as Marius and Marion showed up. Magda and Krista followed a minute or two later, but there was no sign of Darla, and I only half expected Errol. I wasn't expecting Carl, Uncle Sandu, or Lorenzo, so I closed my eyes and thought, morning yoga with Sandy.
Take me to India.
I opened my eyes again when I heard Sandy's voice. Yoga means to unite, to control the senses and ultimately, the mind. Krishna speaks of 4 types of yoga, including bhakti meaning devotion, jnana meaning knowledge, karma meaning action, and dhyana meaning concentration as paths to achieve moksha, the ultimate goal, which is freedom from the endless cycle of reincarnation. From the Bhagavad Gita 6.12-13, we learn the basics of what's required. There, having the mind actively focused upon a single point, with thought and sense activity controlled, sitting on a seat, one should practice yoga for purification of the self. With an aligned body, head, and neck all keeping steady, without movement. Focusing the vision toward the tip of one's nose without looking about in any direction. He paused for a moment, then continued, yoga is part of everyday life of all humans. At different times during their cycle of existence in this realm, they may choose to practice different schools of yoga to meet the requirements of that time and self.
The school of choice may be Anusara Yoga, which focuses on mood enhancement and injury prevention. It's great for beginners or those who are perhaps out of shape.
And Sandy pointed at Cheesy and touched his lips before Cheesy could open his mouth and suggest any names.
Ashtanga Yoga is a more athletic method focused on progressive pose sequences tied to the breath.
The primary series, made up of about 75 poses, requires about 90 minutes to go through, but should you choose to invest that time, it should promote spinal alignment, detoxification of the body, and building strength as well as flexibility.
The continuous flow is central to this practice.
Each time I have done this, it is the flow that carries me. Bikram Yoga is less intense with just 26 basic postures with each repeated twice. This type of yoga is practiced in a 105-degree environment, which is ideal for the desert environment, albeit a tad dry. I will be doing this one today when we finish with our learning session. You are all welcome to stay and join me or remain and take your own path. Hatha Yoga is a classic approach pairing breathing exercises with postures at a beginner level, as is integral yoga, which aims to make yoga an integral part of everyday life. Asanas are accompanied by breathing techniques, mantras, and meditation. There are many more yoga systems you can consider, but it's time to go through some of the poses you will experience in any system. I hated trying to move into a pose while trying to follow Sandy, because he did every pose with such grace as if he had done them thousands of times, like taking a step forward by putting one foot in front of the other. Today we didn't have a guide to go by, so I girded my loins and powered on. I could feel Cheesy's smirk on my cheek. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Errol show up and place his mat at the back, mostly out of sight from the crowd. Yoga, or any type of exercise, was not his thing, but that's not to say he wasn't in shape for bush bashing through the forests at home. It was probably more a case of, why waste your energy before the real thing? I don't go to enough dances to practice for them, mate.
Sandy had to give us a brief explanation of our own anatomy, from a yoga perspective, so that we could follow his directions. The sacrum is a bone structure at the base of your spine, which includes your tailbone. If I refer to your sit bones, then consider the bones most easily felt when you are sitting on a hard surface. Cheesy gathered his best Scottish accent and throughout my wee mud air told me dat would gae me piles if de hard surface wer cold, but let me tell ya, when you're wearing a kilt, it's hard to resist. And then he adjusted himself, and I thought half the people were going to choke on their laughter. The party can always be better if Cheesy is there. They're located toward the underside of your butt or buttocks. No piles will be injured today, Cheesy, kilt or no kilt. The sternum or breastbone is the bone that runs vertically down the center of your chest. Now the crown of your head, not the crown on your head in the case of Prince Melon or perhaps Ian. It is, however, exactly where someone would wear a crown, hopefully not to yoga. The crown is the topmost part of the skull, and when standing or sitting up straight, always make sure that you lift the crown of your head toward the ceiling. It's a very important restructuring, or as Cheesy liked to say, rebooting. Sandy would give us the name of a pose in Sanskrit and then in English, which made me wonder if I was wasting my time speaking the English version to a Hindu god. What's language to a god anyway? Brahma creates all types of people when he throws down those balls of energy during his creation frenzies at the start of yuga cycles. A god is probably a mind reader, or someone who just intuitively knows everything perhaps. If Uncle Sandu were here, he would reply, "Oh, you mean a mother-in-law?" Sandy's plan was to take us through a series of poses within a specific group each day. We would practice each pose until we had mastered it and then move on to the next. When we finished with the lesson for the day, Sandy would lead a vigorous hot yoga session in the very warm morning sun. It stretched my limits in the early days. Let's begin our series of poses with the seated and twists group. Up first is the bound angle or Baddha Konasana. Sit tall on your sit bones, then you're on your knees. Bring the soles of your feet together. Grab your feet or ankles and then lengthen your back, lifting the crown of your head to the ceiling. We continued with the next one, which was cow face or Gomukhasana, before moving on to the lotus known as Padmasana. Cheesy told me later that my pigeon and staff were very weak and that I should work on them. I thanked him for his concern with the middle finger salute. The seated spinal twist or Matsyendrasana, from the staff pose, was all Errol could handle as I saw him slip out toward the jack-in-the-box. I think he needed a stack of hotcakes and syrup applied directly to his sweet tooth. Sandy finished off that day with a modified hot yoga or Bikram yoga routine, but each day we continued learning different poses and being exposed to each of the groups of poses we would eventually need. When we get to India next, each must decide if they wish to make a journey or not. To make a journey, one must be fit both physically and mentally. Such journeys sometimes require more time in the preparation than the journey itself takes. Consider the journey of life. Cheesy, Errol and I spent a couple of days working with Sandy on his underwater construction and coral workshop. In the afternoons, Cheesy and I went off to the property we purchased with Sandy and Dick back in the beginning to meet some of Uncle Sandu's construction workers who were going to build us some basic structures for the next time we came here. We could actually stay on our own land. We were beginning to put on a lot of miles on the bicycles as well, so together with the yoga we were all getting into better physical shape. It's no wonder the Jacks love this place so much. Another yoga day, another yoga group of poses. On that day I believed we learned about standing poses. Cheesy referred to this mime day, and he and Magda were miming everyone for the rest of the day. When Cheesy mimed being locked in a box, Errol mimed locking the box and throwing away the key. We began mime day with the chair or Utkatasana. Stand up straight with your feet together. Bend your knees slightly, sending your butt back and towards the floor as if sitting in a chair. Not like you're returning yesterday's lunch, Errol. Keep your knees together and aligned. Raise your arms straight up next to your ears. I like the dancing Shiva or Lord of the Dance, whatever Sandy called it. It was the Natarajasana. From standing, transfer your weight to the right foot and bring your left heel up to your buttocks. Reach back with your left hand and grasp the inside of your left foot. Lift your left thigh by kicking your foot back into your hand. When you're balanced, raise your right arm straight over your head. We were shown the eagle, Garudasana, the half moon, Ardha Chandrasana, and the lizard known as Uthin Pristhasana. Again, Errol slipped out before the mountain, Tadasana, and the tree, Vrksasana. As per usual, Cheesy criticized my warrior sequence and said it would never be good enough because I was just not built right to be a warrior. He said, warriors generally aren't built with big SS and guts hanging over their belts unless they're baseball warriors. I vowed to myself to work on all of my warriors from 1 through 3, and even the reverse warrior. I'll show him warrior. Besides, I hate baseball. Cheesy, Errol and I decided to take a day and make a trip up to Maria's property. It would be a 10 to 15 kilometer bike ride each way, so we planned to stay for a couple of hours and learn whatever we could about Maria's cave. I told Cheesy I would climb up to the cave with him to take a look inside, to which he replied, "Gravity is less your friend today than it was last year, mate." I knew it would be a struggle, but he was right because he was honest. Rick decided to come with us, and Errol picked up an extra bike for Stephanie, who was waiting for him at the Jack-in-the-Box. Marius and Marion were already at the camp, and I was told that they would meet us at the RV just past noon. Dick had been called back to his unit early and had to pack up and leave right away. He had knocked on the door earlier in the morning and said goodbye. Darla had taken Magda and Krista to Las Vegas for a couple of days to show them the life she'd been living for the past few years since leaving the Soviet circus roots. Everything else stayed in Vegas, or so I was told. When we got to the camp, Marius and Marion were sitting under a large canopy hanging off the RV and covering a patio with a picnic bench in the center. Errol and Cheesy hadn't been there before, so Marius took them and Lorraine on a walk around the property. The view was excellent from this vantage point because you could see all the way down to the sea and across to the other side. Every day was a clear day, so that was never an issue. Marion told me they had done a little research on the document and Father Kino himself. Florin had some of his people look through the archive, but this particular monk had nothing that they could find. Some monks and priests tried to use indigenous languages together with Spanish, but Philip II of Spain decreed in 1570 that Romanized Nahuatl become the official language of the colonies of New Spain in order to facilitate communication between the natives of the colonies. Finding documents and interpreting documents are going to be two quite different things. Why aren't we working with Richard and Lance? I replied, I'm just helping Marius because he shared his information with me. Now it's become a kind of contest with Richard and Lance. I wonder if they know Marius has a Kino map. Rick knew Lance would not be at his camp today because he was going with Richard and Henri to San Diego to meet up with an epigrapher friend of Richard's who was on vacation from his university in England. Lance had invited Rick along, but he declined and decided to come with us to see the cave. Stephanie told us she used to go up to the Kimberley in Australia rock climbing, so she was all go when we hit the vertical. Marion and Marius were mountain goats, and Cheesy had lots left over from his climbing skills to mock mine and Rick's while saving a double dose for Errol. Halfway up the cliff wall it occurred to me how friggin' big is this cave. But it turned out that only a couple of us at a time could go in. Marius went in first and Errol and I were allowed in next so that we could rappel down once finished rather than hang around like the more experienced climbers. The images that Marius had shown us on his phone didn't do justice to the feeling of being inside this area. People are always saying that they can imagine something or empathize with someone. It's rarely true, but usually unquestioned. Marius pointed out several man-made features about the cave and painted a picture of ancient people either hiding something of great value here or living in this area in a space behind the stone which is blocking it. What if there is a passageway behind the rock leading to somewhere else? If there is air flowing, it may be a tunnel system. I proposed. We exited the cave when our time was up and rappelled down the rock face, which was so much easier. I thought, why didn't I come down from the top in the first place?
But when I reached the ground, I realized it was more than 100 meters up to the top.
When we got back together, we sat around the RV and had a fire.
The fire was because it smelled great, not because we needed the warmth.
It also offered us a focal point to sit around and talk.
Rick told us the old Spanish Trail was a trade route that connected northern New Mexico at Santa Fe to Los Angeles at California, a distance of 1,100 kilometers through high mountains, arid deserts, and deep canyons.
It's not necessarily what's on this route, but what's located just off the route that's important.
There are many stories of Spanish families sending vast amounts of wealth to the north for safekeeping rather than home to Spain where relatives may be waiting to abscond with it. The tax on their wealth by the king, the cost of transporting such weight by ship, and the risk of pirates along the way were all factors contributing to the need for the likes of Father Kino. Jesuit fathers helping the Spanish nobles hide their fortunes in very remote locations where they could retrieve it when necessary was a valued service by some. That reminded me of the Templars banking money for nobles going on the Crusades to Jerusalem. Rick went on to read an account of one Don Carlo Montoya who sent 12 donkey carts each year for more than a decade to what he referred to as his hunting camp in the north. Father Kino provided him with a location that would be secure from native populations.
Many were protected by traps or hidden deep within the plateau.
There are supposed to be dozens of such maps, at least according to Lance.
Rick told us.
This was a good start, but I thought, where do we go from here?
The answer was, nowhere today.
The next day was Arm Balance Day, and the day began a little overcast, but I also don't think the bacon and eggs I had were sitting just right on my sit bones, but we began with the crow or kakasana right on schedule. From a standing position, turn your toes outward with your heels touching.
Move your knees towards the ground until your buttocks rest on your heels.
Lean your upper body forward, placing your forearms on the ground.
Knees against your shoulders or your upper arms if you prefer.
Now shift your weight forward onto your hands, lifting your forearms from the floor. Lift your hips but with your knees supported by your upper arms. In full crow, your feet must be all the way off the floor.
Oops, not quite Errol. Good try. Sandy said as I think he was coming to realize that whatever we were going to need yoga for it would probably not include Errol.
The 8-angle pose or Astavakrasana and scale pose, Talasana signaled the end of his journey on Arm Balance Day.
In fact, I don't think he showed for yoga again on the trip. If he could have just lasted through Firefly, Tadebasana, perhaps he could have made it. Cheesy says, no.
I also followed through with Sandy's hot yoga series, which varied a little bit each day, but I found that in this hot desert environment I was working my weight in fast food off. As Uncle Sandu predicted, the fries are fresh cut. The girls were back from Vegas 3 days before the big art weekend and were anxious to get things rolling. Darla was the master of ceremonies for the event, and it was to be broadcast live for the opening ceremonies as well as the last night awards show that was to be hosted by none other than the Poison Voice, with the vile tongue better known as Hylia Toxic. She was expecting coverage all weekend for the artists and the event from an assortment of media. Of course, she had the cooperation of Marius and Marion. The next morning was core day on the Pose Day agenda, which was another difficult day for me either because of the bonfire the night before or the trip to Palm Desert with Magda and Krista to pick up prize packages for the award show participants. We pushed the boat known as Paraperna out from the Yoga Yacht Club first, balancing on your sit bones. The back and legs must rise from the mat, creating a V-shape with your body.
The back is straight. I see some rounded backs.
Legs bent at the knee with shins parallel to the floor for the half boat pose. Straighten the legs to reach full boat pose now.
Very good, let's do it one more time before we move on.
Sandy went on through Danarasana, the bow, Marjaryasana, the ever-popular cat-cow, and then the dolphin.
We chased the four-limbed staff pose, or Chaturanga Dadasana, with the plank, Phalankasana, and his sidekick, side plank, Vasisthasana.
Eventually we made it to Locust or Salambasana, or as Cheesy liked to call this one, Shambhala. A day before the start of the art weekend, Cheesy borrowed a van from Uncle Sandu and we made a trip to San Diego to visit a friend of his to acquire a parcel. I wasn't sure why we were going when we left, but I was on side with the idea by the time we got back. It was the plan Cheesy had for our Ridgeway-style performance piece.
Costumes, in fact.
Sandy left us to our own devices for the weekend while the art festival was on, so we spent most of our time walking up and down the berm watching the artists compose their pieces. Each day at the bonfire we would talk about our favorite pieces, and then the next day everyone would go and visit them to see which would be their new favorite. On the second night of the art weekend, we had our bonfire in the canyon at Marius's property where we could view the entire Salton Sea area. This was a perfectly clear night with a full moon that reflected back off the still sea brighter than it went in. Campfires appeared everywhere as the sun went down. We could see the areas where Uncle Sandu had created campgrounds for the visitors and the artists. It was a spectacular vista and an indicator of the future to come.
Dick pointed his grandfather's bonfire across to the other canyon wall.
Cheesy and Errol had draped a king-size bedsheet on the cliff and projected an image onto it so that we could have a conference call with Halls Falls where they had new videos of the Tasmanian tigers and also a tour of our kennel and laboratory buildings for the cell tradettes.
We made sure others would not see the tiger shots by erecting a blocking sheet.
Errol had set up with the fire between the screen and a big circle of chairs where we could have our conference call with our Tasmanian crew who were waiting at the Halls Falls location for our call. Attendees included Mary, Uncle's artist, and Arthur, as well as Travis and TMer. Mary made the trek over to Halls Falls because she was getting lonely in Hobart with everyone away. I should have gone to Melbourne or Adelaide for the summer.
Errol piped in, "Come on now, Mom, you wanted to come to Las Vegas with us, didn't you?"
Stop pouting, and we all laughed because Mary wasn't a gambler but sure would have liked to come with us on this trip. I think I might just give Mary and the uncles a trip to the Salton Sea next year as a Christmas present, if my house is in any state of completion by then.
Magda interjected with, "Krista and I have a new song we've learned that we want to play for Uncle Artis and Uncle Arthur.
It's an Australian classic called A Nautical Yarn." She began with her guitar and Krista with her violin. Magda began, "I sing of a captain who's well known to fame, a naval commander, Bill Jinks is his name," and continued with a jaunty tune for the next several minutes ending in, "They had stuck on a sandbank. So the men walked ashore and a rousing applause went up from Tasmania to California." I'm sure that even Uncle Sandu, who had showed up for the bonfire, enjoyed the tribute. The new footage they had of the tigers was astounding. TMer had just put out some fresh bedemolan meat that he found as roadkill, and you could see him walking away in the first video. He didn't even turn around because the tiger was so quiet and stealthy.
"I had no idea that little blighter was scopping me," TMer exclaimed.
When they compared the video with the first video, it was not the same animal.
Uncle Artis added, "We also had another one in the trap, so we have a second DNA sample. It couldn't be the same one because this one is female."
Visually they look the same, but lighting from time of day and different camera lenses, it's hard to tell.
It will be simple for you to compare DNA and know whether we have one or two.
Uncle Arthur told us, "My friend Rob has recorded a thylacine near the Jane River in western Tas, so I'm taking a trip to the Jane and Franklin Rivers with Travis and TMer who have a tour going there next week. I'm gonna leave some camera traps in very remote areas and see if we can find more of the habitat these little buggers like, now that we know they do still exist.
So, you'll be working for Travis and T. Emmer next week, Uncle Arthur?
I queried, and he replied, I'll be lucky to get beer money for my trouble, mate. That would indeed be a considerable sum for a week on their budget. Tomorrow was the final day of the art festival, so we planned an early start to see how our chosen favorites were finishing up. The weather was never a question here, because I don't think I can remember being here when it rained. Although it can be very hot, it's generally breezy and nice in the shade. As we strolled along the berm looking at the art on display, I noticed how much of the rail system had already been built. They were running a small section that went along the east side, where the art weekend was being held. Several of the cars had been painted by artists participating in the weekend challenge while they were here. Many of the artists had been commissioned to design cars for their sponsors after the weekend was over. It was evident by the TV cameras everywhere that the festival was coming to a climax, and the winners were being predicted by every amateur art critic in attendance. The sun was almost to the horizon when all of the lights were lit, just as the Poison Voice took the stage to an odd mixture of cheers and boos that I couldn't quite figure out. He seemed to be just as popular with the people who disliked him as he was with the people who liked him. Very odd, but then so was he. Darla was on stage as well, so that took a lot of the attention away from the Poison Voice. She presented him with the judges' envelopes for each of the 3 categories, and the winners eventually made their way to the podium to accept their award personally from the Poison Voice. A great honor, supposedly. For the final award, Marius and Marion appeared out of nowhere from above the stage and landed several feet on either side of the Poison Voice. The look on his face was priceless, and I think he almost crapped himself without being gabooned. Darla accepted the envelope from the jacks, who disappeared as quickly as they appeared, but with the cheers of the crowd this time, and she passed it on to Hialeah Toxic, who was left with his mouth gaping open. She tapped him on the bottom of his chin, closing his mouth as she passed, which sent the crowd into hysterics when he bit his tongue. The winner of the final category, as well as the best in the show, was an image created by a Dutch artist that Krista had taken a particular interest in. She told me she found his work to speak to her on so many levels. I had to agree that the winning image was sort of like looking at Van Gogh's brilliant field of sunflowers, but in the night when it was a brilliant field of stars that almost converged to create a garden of flowers clustered together in their most minute form. The cosmic theme was clear. The final night of an event like the art festival was always anticlimactic. Cheesy and I walked down the berm to view the diving park in the moonlight and ran into Errol and Stephanie returning from the coral laboratory. We strolled along the berm and picked up more stranglers as we spent the next several hours walking back to the Seabreeze Motel. The next day saw backbends, or bend over day as Cheesy dubbed it. A good day as I remember it, because I recall starting to feel like I was back in shape that day. Could I hold on to this until I got the chance to go back to India? That's going to be a challenge back in Taz, especially with Errol wimping out. I guess I will have to put up with Cheesy smocking, at least for now. The bridge known as Situbanda Sarvangasana carried us on our journey that morning. Lie face up on the mat. Arms should be at your sides. Bend your knees, bringing the soles of your feet to the mat. Now move your heels toward your buttocks until your fingertips can reach them. Rolling onto your outer shoulder blades, lift your hips from the mat until they create a straight diagonal line from your knees to your shoulders. These poses appealed to me, and I plan to choose something from here at least several times a week. The camel or Ustrasana, or the cobra, Bhujangasana. Lie face down on the mat with your palms on the mat alongside your ribs. Now lift your chest off the mat, bringing your gaze forward and slightly upward, rooting through your thighs and the tops of your feet. You are Bhujangasana.
I loved hearing Sandy say those words in my head while I was Bujingasana.
Upward-facing dog or Urdhva Mukha was similar, and the wheel or Urdhva Dhanurasana came after crossing the bridge. I had to meet up with Cheesy and Errol for a rehearsal of our Ridgeway quality performance that was coming up only too soon.
Cheesy and I were waiting at the pool when Errol finally showed up. Sorry mates, I was having breakfast at the Jack's and lost track.
He was having breakfast with Stephanie, and I didn't want to read anything into that because I had mostly chosen to ignore what other people did, but Errol was too close for that perhaps. I knew Cheesy would take a different approach, so I let it slide from my perspective and would only intervene if Cheesy pushed Errol's pendulum too far. That night was our opportunity to redeem ourselves and perform at the campfire to prove we had any talent at all outside of science. Cheesy had found a song for us to sing that required no instruments. We rehearsed our beating tempo every chance we got, and not a single person asked what we were doing.
I guess they just thought we were cool people with rhythm. Probably not.
The song was known on the internet as The Wellerman and was a sea ballad from New Zealand from more than 150 years ago. The song referred to the supply ships owned by the Weller brothers, who were amongst the earliest whale merchants. We loved the song but knew that the lyrics would not sit well with Magda or her sisters, so Cheesy rewrote them, and we sang the song while we beat our chests and dressed as a tiger, a devil, and Cheesy was our captain.
There once was a lass who came to me. The name of the lass was Magda T.
The winds blew up, her head dipped down.
Oh help, my beaker boys, help, ha!
Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go. She'd not been 6 weeks or more when down on her a pouch did bore.
Cheesy called all hands and swore
he'd get that clone to grow, ha! Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go.
Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da.
Before she asked if we ought to, the tiger's clone came out and got her. All hands to her side, pouched and taught her.
When she dived deep and low, ha!
Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go.
No cage was cut, no clone was freed. Magda's mind was not of greed,
and she belonged to the clonerman-esque creed.
They took that clone in tow, ha!
Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go.
Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. For 40 days or even more. The pouch went slack then tight once more. All clones were lost, except number 4.
But still that clone did grow, ha! Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go. As far as I've heard, the fight's still on. The line's not over, and the clone's not gone. The clonerman makes his regular call
to encourage Magda, crew, and all, ha!
Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go. Soon may the clonerman come to bring our tiger and devil and run. One day, when the cloning is done, we'll take our leave and go." By the time we got to the chorus the third time, everyone was singing along. The chorus reverberated around the campfire for a half an hour afterwards. Needless to say, our skit was a great fireside success. The girls wanted to play the song with us for Uncle Arthur and Uncle Artis when we got the chance. They promised to be ready. It did bring a tear to Magda's eye, so I think we achieved Ridgeway success. The next day, or the day of forward bends, would have given Errol the bends, but he had long since stopped showing up for yoga and spent his time at Sandy's Choral Laboratory with Stephanie Murdoch, the PhD student from Melbourne. It turned out she had spent her summers in Hobart working at a bar her cousin owned. She loved bush bashing in western Tasmania on the remote rivers like the Jane, Franklin and Denison, or staying at her cousin's cottage on Lake Gordon with her Uncle Nevin. These were all places Errol knew well, so they had a lot in common. She was missing that part of the world, but her work was very important to her as well. Stephanie was well respected in the industry, according to Dr. Sue and Sandy, who had recruited her for the project at the Salton Sea from a vast group of individuals who would have loved the opportunity. Downward-facing dog, or Adho Mukha Svanasana, hands should be shoulder-width apart and placed firmly on the mat. Feet are hip-distance apart with your weight evenly distributed between your hands and your feet. Your heels are pushing toward the floor. Do you feel anything? The happy baby, or Ananda Balasana, was probably not happy with my pose, and standing forward bend, or Uttanasana, was a mountain pose movement which I found difficult for some reason. Three-legged dog was also known as the dreaded Tripada Adho Mukha Svanasana, or down dog split. Cheesy would always shout, "Damn third leg," whenever he did this one. It had been a long time since it last garnered a laugh, but he couldn't help himself. He was caught in a recursive loop. Triangle, or Trikonasana, moved from Warrior 2. I was finally getting better at the Warriors. Straddling forward bend, or Prasarita Padottanasana, was a doozy. With feet wide apart based on flexibility, but wider than shoulder width, if you please. Outsides of your feet should be parallel. Now bend forward at the hips, resting your hands on the floor. Now, if it's possible, bring the crown of your head to the floor and enter a headstand. I considered the last step optional, but unfortunately, I didn't see inversion poses coming. I knew I should have read ahead, but there are just too few days left to party like this with these people. It's been like a family reunion for the whole summer. The next day we were sitting around the pool in the late afternoon when Uncle Sandhu came into the area with a laptop. "I'm glad to find you here. Marius and Marion are coming too. Ian wants to talk to us all." Darla, Magda, and Krista were already here with Errol, Cheesy, me and Stephanie. Sandy and Rick had been called and were on their way from the Coral Warehouse. As we waited, we tried to find out what it was about from Uncle Sandhu, but he continued to plead ignorance, so we just prepared ourselves for the screening. Ian finally appeared in the sharing window and said, "Well, more world events are happening this year." I don't believe it would have hit the news over there just yet, but there has been a coup in Prince Melon's country. His older brother Prince Broken Tusk attempted to overthrow his father, King Jumbo Tusk. His efforts were thwarted and he was killed in the melee outside his father's residence. This prompted Prince Melon's younger brother, Prince Sateo Tusk, to finish the coup attempt on his father. Does that put Prince Melon in danger? Marion asked, realizing he was older than Sateo. Ian replied, "Actually no, his younger brother supports Prince Melon's claim to the royal throne of his country. He's now King Melon Tusk, and we all applauded even though some of us didn't know him personally. We knew the others did, and we knew he made a difference at the Salton Sea." Pendulums of the world were swinging everywhere this year, I thought at the time. The next day was the topsy-turvy day of inversions, as Magda referred to it. There seemed to be more construction workers taking their early morning breaks during our yoga session times than there were when we first started. The Jack-in-the-Box patio seating seemed to have a show when the Celtradettes showed up. Even Lorenzo seemed to be getting up earlier that morning for his coffee and croissants. Sandy moved right into the lesson with handstand or at home Mukha Vrksasana. For this inversion of the mountain pose, start in a downward dog with your hands a few inches from a wall. He paused as we repositioned for the first pose. Now bring one foot closer to your hands and hop with the back foot until you have found a comfortable hopping to lead you all the way up to the handstand, supported by the wall. Participants and audience both increased the decibels of their communications on an ever-increasing wave until everyone found their way back to their mats and a sitting position. Supported headstand or Salamba Sirsasana, which Cheesy called Salamator for sissies, was next. From there Sandy lead us into supported shoulder stand or Salamba Sarvangasana, and finally we were the plow, Halasana. I think I remained face down for the next 5 minutes, dreaming I was laying on the beach. We had to say goodbye to Lorenzo that morning, so we made sure we had a long breakfast sit at the Jack-in-the-Box before he was off for his plane. I think we probably ended up having one of everything on the menu by the time his car arrived to take him to the San Diego airport. Cheesy slipped an order of greasy mozzarella garlic bread into his take-on luggage. Cheesy wanted to take a run around the Salton Sea outside of the berm with the motorcycles before we left, so today seemed like the day to do that. Like our trip through the Riviera, I only had to keep up with Cheesy. No matter how you looked at it, half the time we were heading into the sun and half the time we had it at our backs, but around the whole route we only passed 3 other vehicles coming the other way. People were here, but they were staying indoors during the heat of the day like this. The water will bring the temperatures down and open up lots of water sports, but it's freaking hot, as Errol would say. On the last day of our Pose Day series, as the Celtradettes construction crew were calling it, Sandy had the restorative poses to present to us. Before he could assume the position and start, a crew of about 15 of the construction workers spread out their yoga mats and joined the class to a huge applause from everyone. They even stayed for the hot yoga session at the end. It turned out many of them were also circus employees as well as construction workers and practiced yoga daily. It was all part of their lifestyle at the circus or on the road. Sandy began with the child's pose or balasana, is a good place to begin. Please join me in kneeling on your mat with big toes touching and your knees about hip width apart. Now bring your upper body forward to rest on your thighs and bending at the hips. Your arms can be left at your sides or extended all the way forward on the mat, it is your choice. We went through Crocodile or Makarasana, Easy, which is known as Sukhasana, and Hero or Virasana. We ended with Corpse, which is Savasana, typically reserved for the end of the practice, but we still had the hot yoga after this, so I made a mental note not to get comatose in my corpse. Lie face up, arms comfortably resting at your sides with your palms facing upward. Your feet and legs turn gently outward. Done. Before we could begin the hot yoga, one of the Celtradettes workers approached Sandy and they spoke for a moment. The next thing I knew, Sandy was placing his mat beside mine and the other fellow was leading us in the hot yoga. Apparently, they had been watching all week and then repeated it on their lunch break. That must have been so freaking hot. Holy shit! The day can reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit here during the summer. Cheesy, Errol and I spent the next couple of days shopping for souvenirs to take home to the crew. We went everywhere from the local Walmart to Palm Springs and everywhere in between. The things we got Mary were going to warm the cockles of her heart. We even got some extra special items for her Christmas stocking.
We had a last bonfire that night and saw the sunrise before getting freshened up for our trip to the airport and the flight home.
There was just no time to sleep when we were all together like this. With a trip to Taz, there was lots of time to sleep on board. On the way home to Taz, I was able to get a call through to Ian to discuss several topics he had emailed me about. I asked him about the Tesla group and how Florin and Carl were able to arrange for this group to come together and how they earned their cooperation with the Pendulum group. To allow for the right people to benefit from Nikola Tesla's legacy, they must be able to link their DNA to Tesla's mother's DNA.
This gives the siblings of Nikola an equal say.
Their children will automatically get a proportionate share of the business, with each level diminishing in value but continuing in perpetuity. When someone dies, their proportional share returns to the group and the new children born are added. I asked Errol what his idea of a family was and he replied, "You have to set some parameters for me, mate. I imagine you're looking for a middle-class family in a developed country with a traditional structure for their society.
No influence of religion." Spot on, I replied.
He thought for a moment and he said, "Let's start in the Middle Ages when the mother had to have a dozen kids or so just to have half a dozen left to support her and the hubby in their old age.
Her husband could have been anything from a pig farmer in the country to a lamplighter in the city. Each role was clear. Fast forward a dozen generations to the days of the American family sitcoms, or the more familiar Australian ones for me. They all had mom working the home front and managing the kids while dad went out to pursue a career because he was the only one given an education. When that generation was able to educate all their children, then the next generation of moms and dads could both pursue careers and seek the personal glory of work. That sent the pendulums of inflation swinging wildly, so the family needed two incomes just to jog in place. Children had to be watched, someone had to clean the house and someone had to make the meals, but no one had the time or skills to do those tasks. Hire someone to do those jobs. Is that a different class that does those jobs? The children of that generation were busy too. They needed more education to achieve goals set higher by their glory-seeking parents. Get the jump on education and start early with boarding schools or even DNA enhancements. Their little pendulums were swinging back and forth like ping-pong balls at the Olympics. I asked, then why would the children need their parents? They could be born in a test tube or in a person for hire.
Modern society dictates the modern family. The pendulum will always keep seeking equilibrium.
He replied.